and for his support for our programme, and to Tim Carey, to Sean Hogan, and all in the Custom House for their help and support also. But back to Tomás, who has achieved so much to date, with much, much more to come. He completed a PhD, which explored the memory of the Irish War of Independence at the University of Limerick 6 years ago in 2015. He is the founder of Cuimhneamh an Chláir, Memories of Clare, and was commended by Uachtarán hÉireann, Michael D. Higgins, when presenting him with the Comhaltas Centenary Award in 2016. Now, on top of all of that, Tomás has published several books on the Irish Revolutionary period, and his next book, The Scariff Martyrs, War, Murder and Memory in East Clare, will be published later this year by Mercier Press. Tomás runs Mac Conmara Heritage Consulting, which specialises in developing oral history programmes and surveys, and is also the manager of the Cork Folklore Project. His presentation for us now is titled Always in the Human Consciousness, Memory and the Irish War of Independence. And he tells us that given the Irish War of Independence, it is in many ways embedded in the Irish historical consciousness, and that stories of blackened towns continue to dominate the landscape of memory across the country. Tonight, Tomás will explore A, why the memory of that period is so strong, B, how it has been preserved, and C, what our relationship with that time means for understanding of the past. He will do this by using some audio examples of recordings from both his private collection and other archives he has worked with. As always, of course, our speaker will be delighted to answer questions afterwards. You can type them and any comments you wish to make on our Facebook page. So therefore, we welcome you, Tomás, and hand over to you now.
Look, thanks very much for that introduction, and I'm really grateful to both yourself and Liz for inviting me to speak as part of your centenary series. And I'm aware for years what you've been doing in relation to the Custom House, not just on the landmark centenary year, but for years, for over 10 years, I think. So, I have great respect for both of you as historians, obviously, and I'm very honoured to be invited to speak. You mentioned there, Michal, about the title being Always in the Human Consciousness, and that is a very conscious title, which came from a man called John Quealy from County Clare in West Clare, and he used it to describe, a specific event in West Clare, which was the murder of Willie Shanahan and Michael Mac Conmara, two IRA volunteers in December 1920. But it, I think, reflects broadly my theory or my philosophy on the War of Independence and how it managed to endure within the consciousness of the people. And, the way in which it endured within the memory of the people and the consciousness of the people has always attracted me from whenever I was very, very young. And, that very simple sort of an impulse that I felt when I was, very, very young, even 11, 12, 13 years of age, and my own townland in East Clare, in Ballymalone, that still runs through the work that I do, because I think to reflect any, war or episode that was experienced at such a fundamentally local level, you have to go back down to that local level in order to try and build the pieces of history or the pieces of memory that when you put them all together with other records and other information, give us a better sense of the past. And I suppose I felt, and I know both of you agree, and others are increasingly becoming aware of it, that memory and oral history had been very much marginalized within the way in which historians approached this period. And it never made sense to me, and it still doesn't make sense that a lot of historians and often academics don't put much emphasis on memory, and particularly local memory, because they're ignoring the closest connection that you have to that period of time. And my ambition has always been to try and bridge the gap between our time and our understanding and the experience of that time. And in order to do that, memory, in my view, is the best pathway to do it. So look, you've explained what the intentions of the lecture are. So I'll share the screen and say we'll start it off. And I do look forward to the end of it to answering any questions that you might have. So hopefully everybody is able to see this, and if not, let me know, but I think we're okay. So the first piece of audio, I'm going to play about 5 pieces of audio throughout the lecture, but I have 2 pieces of audio to begin with, and the first one is particularly special in a way in that it will be the first time publicly that this voice has ever been played. It comes from a collection generated by a man called Untitled Chapter in the 1970s and 80s. Now, in fact, the interview itself was done by somebody else, but Untitled managed to get it within his collection, which was deposited at the Military Archives of Ireland back in 2018. And I had the great honour and privilege of being commissioned by the Military Archives to listen through to all of the tapes. You know, you'll be familiar that these are the tapes, of course, that led to the books, the hÉireann, the Twilight Years, Survivors, and Harry by Untitled Chapter, which are 3 seminal publications. But there was so much more in the tapes and in the interviews that he did for the book than are in the books, which was fascinating. But in one interview, we hear a man called Archibald Armstrong, and you'll hear from the piece of memory what his particular story is. I will encourage you all to listen very carefully and to also read the transcription of the audio as you're listening, because just bear with me. So I should have said as well before I played it, and fortunate that I have the chance now this time, that when you hear Archibald Armstrong speaking, his language is fairly colourful, so probably right to give a bit of a warning about that once we're seeing as we're live on Facebook. So here we go again.
Outside the town of Mac Conmara, the towns in the big grocery tenders went tracking along to their doom. And the Irish Republican Army made shit of the whole fucking lot. But I'm a better one than that. Old Salvato Thompson was at Scotland Yard, and because of the sinners, the going was hard. So we sent Hammer Greenwood, a much better man, and he filled up the land with the bows like in town. And there's a sinner listening to this structure. Hi, my name is Archibald Armstrong. I'll be 85 next March.
I understand you had something to do with Ireland when you were a young man.
Yes.
Can you tell me when that was?
Oh,
Roughly.
1920.
And what was it you did in 1920 that had something to do with Ireland?
I was a black and tan.
And what is a black and tan, John?
I don't know. You answer that. But rephrase it.
Okay, so that was Archie, and apologies again for the issue with the sound there. But I just wanted to play it, obviously, because it is unusual to have the voice of a black and tan to hear from. But I suppose the 2 voices are the 2 kind of stories that have come to us from that period are generally, in the main, about the black and tans and about the IRA. And we're going to hear from an IRA man who was involved in fighting against the black and tans during that time. Now, obviously, there are so many other dimensions of that experience that we must attend to when we're looking at that period. And they're there, and they were present, and they were understood. But when we talk about the big monoliths of that time, we generally refer to the Black and Tans, and we refer to the IRA. So it was interesting to get that voice, at least. Whether there was much perspective in it or not, it's a different story. We're going to hear a little bit more from Archie a little bit later on. But what I'm going to play now is a short piece again from a man called Dan Gleeson, who was a Tipperary man from outside Nina and part of the 1st Tipperary Brigade in North Tipperary. And he talks, just generally reflects in an interview with Untitled Chapter about that experience. And again, just to get a perspective of somebody who would have been potentially facing Archie in the field during that time. So we'll hear from Dan, and again, it's about a minute long. You won't need the transcription here. The voice is very, very clear and understandable.
Well, I will say this in all fairness now, like, during 1920, I'd say, all along that period in the winter period of 1920, there was hardly a night but we were out.
Yeah.
Block and row with all kinds of activity.
Very active, yeah.
It was nearly full time. You got home and you tried to have a week's sleep, and you had tried to do something. But that was the story, like, with the Tan War.
Yeah.
And I have this to say, like, that all the fellas that I came in contact with, I pay them great tribute, because with very few exceptions, they didn't know what fear was.
Yeah.
The equipment and the kind of an enemy they were dealing.
Yeah.
I'd say this now in all sincerity, that they all believed that there was nothing, it was victory and nothing less.
Yeah, yeah.
And that we were winning and going to win. There was no other way, like.
Yeah.
There was no despondency.
Yeah.
And when someone was killed, well, it was a sacrifice, of course, but it didn't know. We must go on, put more determination to go on with the struggle and to win.
So there's two of the voices from that time, from a kind of a conventional Black and Tan and a conventional IRA man in that sense. And I suppose the job for us is to try and figure out, what are the other elements, what are the other nuances, what is the experience behind the activism of Dan Gleeson, behind the involvement of somebody like Archie Armstrong, what is the experience generally across the communities of the country during that time, and why has it endured in such a way across 100 years now at this point, and why does it show in many ways no signs of lessening or weakening? If you take last year and the controversy around Charlie Flanagan's attempts to commemorate the Black and Tans on RIC, you got a reminder of how strong the memory still is, and how much the feeling has been passed on. So to answer that one latter question, or to explore it a bit, the often repeated quote of Padraig Pearse, "They have left us our Fenian dead." It's something I suppose we read about in school an awful lot. We hear it referred to in history generally, and multiple times. But to try and explore that a little bit more, I think, takes us to the depths of our memory and to the real reason why we remember the period of the War of Independence so strongly, particularly in rural areas around Munster, for certain. But the reason for that, I think, goes even deeper than the Fenian period, but certainly the Fenian period is relevant. I'm just going to open up the slideshow to get the next slide up, and yeah, so we're in business. But in 1948, a man called H.Y. Blythe set out to do some research into the Fenian period, and he wrote, interestingly, in papers across the country at that time, appealing to IRA volunteers from the War of Independence period to try and document and send him information about the Fenians before them. And he made the following comment: "The men who fought in the flying columns were the lineal successors of those earlier Fenians who pointed the way to Irish freedom." Now, we talk about it a lot in the context of, passing on the flame, etc., within Republican narrative. But, how real is that? And I think when you look into it, it is very, very real, and certainly for some families. And remember, you know, in any of the revolutionary periods we've had, or any of the insurrections we've had, you know, it was a relatively small number of people, of men and women, who were driving the revolutionary insurgencies and brought popular support in behind that. So the maintenance of a tradition like a Fenian tradition didn't necessarily have to be right across the whole community, but within certain sections of that community. Once it was maintained and kept alive, it seemed to be sufficient to continue the, I suppose, revolutionary commitment across generations. And I have an example of this, which is directly relevant to the Custom House context. The man you're looking at here is John Connors. As you can see, he was a baker in Feakle. Now, the image is taken from a British report that I got in London a number of years ago about Fenians across the country and in County Clare, where, as Michal said, I'm from myself, and most of my research is, a lot of my research is based. But in 1866, in January, the 20th of January, 1866, John Connors is sitting in a small derelict house in a townland called Drumnanav in Feakle in East Clare. He's sitting there with, he's 21 years of age himself. He's sitting with a constable in the RIC called Michael Culhane. Michael is from Limerick, and I must thank Ger Brown if Ger is watching. I think he is, but Ger is a fantastic historian from Clare who has done tremendous work on the RIC amongst many other areas of history. And he was able to establish that Michael Culhane was born in 1844 in Limerick and passed that information on to me. So Michael Culhane, the constable that was with this man, John Connors, was about 22 years of age, 23 years of age at the time. Both of them are sitting in this derelict house in Feakle, and they're waiting for a 21-year-old man called Michael Slattery. Now, Michael Slattery was the leader of the Fenian movement in East Clare at the time, and would have been a target certainly of the British Crown forces. John Connors here had convinced, it would seem, Michael Culhane, the RIC constable, to join the Fenian movement, which wasn't extraordinary at the time. There had been a number of RIC men who joined the Fenian movement. But on this occasion, it transpired that Michael Culhane was not going to join the Fenians, but had been pretending to do so in order to get information, particularly on Michael Slattery. We don't have a photograph of Michael, unfortunately, but we're lucky to have the John Connors one. The report he sent, which went up to Dublin Castle afterwards, describes as follows from Michael Culhane. In a short time, Slattery came in and welcomed me and shook hands with me. After some time, Slattery sent the servant boy for a rifle and showed it to me, and afterwards another. I saw a number of percussion caps with Slattery, went through the manual and platoon exercises, and did it pretty well. Subsequently, he handed me a book and repeated the Fenian oath and told me to kiss the book. I pretended to do so and kissed my thumb. Now, this is the report that, of course, led to the arrest and imprisonment of both Slattery and John Connors. And Connors was released subsequently a number of years later, had suffered quite badly, not as badly, unfortunately, or not as badly as Michael Slattery had suffered in jail. And both were released subsequently, but Michael died a very, very young man in 1875 at the age of 29. Now, here in Feakle in 1881, this monument you're looking at was put up in his honour, erected by the nationalists of the County of Clare as a tribute to his unswerving fidelity to the cause of his country. So that monument was put up in 1881. Now, in 1916, his nephew was in Jacob's Biscuit Factory as part of an occupation of that building as part of the Easter Rising of 1916. And on the 25th of May, 1921, that nephew was in the customs house where his hand was shot off, or at least he lost his hand afterwards, after he was hit with automatic fire as he left. And as any of you, certainly Liz and Michal will know, I'm referring to Jimmy Slattery, who went on to become one of the more famous IRA volunteers in Dublin, because he was a key member of Michael Collins' squad, and from quite early on, in fact. And he was the nephew of Michael Slattery. So you see a direct connection there with the Fenian movement of 1866, the Easter Rising of 1967, or the Easter Rising of 1916, and the subsequent involvement of Jimmy Slattery that you see on the left-hand side in the Free State uniform. He took the Free State side as most of the squad did. But it's a useful illustration, again, as I say, of that deep connection that we often find when we look for it within that Fenian movement. But there is this other part of this whole story I want to look at, which is this conversation between the national and the local. I'll talk a lot about tonight about the local and the value of local memory and, you know, what is to be gained in terms of our understanding of that time. But the conversation between what's happening nationally and what's happening locally is interlinked all the time. And interestingly, in December of 1919, Jimmy Slattery was involved with Tom Keogh, another member of the squad. Tom Keogh is on the left-hand side of the photograph there, and Jimmy is on the right. I think that's Vinnie Byrne in the middle, but I couldn't be 100% sure on that. But they're involved in the ambush on Lord French, who you see on the right-hand side, at Ashtown in Dublin, where Martin Savage is killed. But after that, they went down to Clare, and they spent time in Bodyke on the run after that period. And while they were there, they stayed very close to a man called James McAvoy. Now, McAvoy had just found out that his son had been driving the car for Lord French, but had survived the attack. Now, McAvoy went on subsequently to be the driver of the boat that led to the capture of the Scariff Martyrs, which I'll talk about later on, but he wasn't involved in it, but there was an ironic connection in it. But as I said, it's interesting where you have this event in Dublin of tremendous significance, an action against the Lord Lieutenant in Dublin, and then two of the men involved end up staying very close to the father of the man who was driving Lord French's car. So there's this constant conversation, this constant interlinking of the experience from the national to the local. Even though the local is the primary, and I'll reflect on that later, but there is always that conversation happening. I want to go a little bit deeper, just briefly. Again, I've always felt that to ignore the environment or the culture that people are born into, say, for example, the generation who would have fought in the War of Independence, to ignore the culture that they were brought into is fundamentally flawed in any interpretation of that time. Because while it's not guaranteed, there is no doubt that for many of those people, you might have the direct connections, like Jimmy Slattery had to his uncle, Michael Slattery, in the Fenians. But it wouldn't even necessarily need direct connections, but there's an experience that a community or communities go through, which can often manifest in terms of later feelings on events like the War of Independence, like the Easter Rising of 1916. And we have to look at the experience of the generation in the late 19th century. The evictions, which were rampant, particularly in my county in Clare, but across the country, of course. And the whole landlord system and the injustice of that, you know, is remembered, and remembered quite strongly. And when something like the Easter Rising happens, and it is looked on in a very clear dichotomy of Irish Republicans against British rule, most of the people, or very, very many of the people, have you know, more than a subsurface respect for the fight against that British rule, because they have some feeling or connection to the injustice at the heart of the British system of rule that their people would have experienced. And, you know, the evictions are a very clear example of that. And I just very briefly looked through these images. This is taken in Moyasta in West Clare, and it's a photograph of Thomas Birmingham's home in Moyasta, which is near Kilrush. Van Delure was the landlord, the relevant landlord at the time. And I was very fortunate over the years to interview many times the man on the right-hand side, who was Matthew Birmingham. The photograph on the left-hand side shows his father, who was also Matthew. But what is significant, I'm not going to play the piece of audio here because it won't carry as well as it could. But what's important is that Matthew died at the age of 101. I'd interviewed him several times over the years, but he had often told me that during the eviction in 1888, his father is inside of that building. Now, as we're taking a look at that photograph now, inside the building, we see the battering ram, we see the eviction is taking place. But if you look closely at where the arrow is pointing, you'll see steam rising from the building. And that steam is rising from a pot that's inside in the building. In that pot is gruel, which is being stewed by Matt Birmingham's 15-year-old father at the time. Inside also was Matthew's grandfather, Thomas Birmingham. So you can literally see the steam rising, which is being stirred by Matthew's father. Now, I was able to hear that story and the detail around it from Matthew in 2012, 11 and 12, 130 odd years after the steam came out of that house and it was captured as one of the Vandeleur photographs. So we can have those direct connections within the memory and the oral tradition that we can document, but we also know that the feelings come with it. So for people like the Birminghams, for people like the others who were evicted within the Vandeleur context, that lingers. And I'm not saying it turns all of them into Republicans, but certainly in a community it is remembered as an injustice. And, that is manifest later in terms of the levels of support within the communities to the Republican movement that we see across the country. In Bodyke, in East Clare, closer to my own home place, we had a very similar experience the year before that in 1887. And without going into any detail on this, it was a very significant episode at the time. It showed how political mobilization was taking place, how that mobilization was becoming more and more radical, where people on the ground were seeing that they had, that what was happening politically was affecting them in the pocket, it was affecting them on the field, and that they were prepared to be more involved in their own liberation, be that on the land or more at an explicitly political level. But certainly the experiences of the evictions play out, in later years, because in the Dyke, the whole communities would have come from, for anybody who knows the area, from around Northeast Clare to the eviction scenes every day over the 2 weeks in which they were taking place, and would have supported the tenants as they held off against the evicting parties. So it was very much a community experience, and a very broad community experience that was passed on in the generations that followed. And there were dramas that were made about the Bodyke evictions, which I've been told by people who attended them were very, very emotional. And people had to be held back at times even from the floor from attacking the bailiffs when they would arrive on stage during those eviction scenes. This was in the 50s and 60s. So those experiences are really, really important. We have direct, and there are multiple direct connections between IRA volunteers in the 20s and people who were evicted in the 1880s. So we have those direct connections, but we also have, as I said, the community memory connection to that period, which I believe is very, very important. So when I keep moving on, just to again further underline the role that memory plays in Republican culture throughout this period, these images are from an autograph book which was compiled in Frongo internment camp in North Wales in late 1916. And throughout this, I wrote a book on this at one point, and you can see in all of the contributions, the one on the right is from Michael Collins, where again he's reflecting on a poem by William Rooney, which again reflects on memory and the commitment to memory and the loyalty to memory, which is a theme throughout Republican culture, but particularly at this time. On the left-hand side, Cathal MacDougall, who was a Protestant that converted to Catholicism and became a very strong Republican. He was also an artist. He illustrated the books. You can see here the interlink between the Dalcassians, the ancient warriors of Thomond, and the warriors of 1916, Fianna Fáil not being the political party, but the soldiers of destiny of the 1916 period in that context. So it's running right through the entire episode, that commitment to memory. In 1917, which I believe is a really, really important year for the Republican movement and for the revolutionary period generally, we see obviously significant episodes that take place. This autograph book is from Francis Shenner's, Republican from Ennis, and you can see where he puts his address down as 12 De Valera Street. Now, De Valera Street doesn't exist, but at the time De Valera, of course, had been elected the previous July to the East Clare as the East Clare candidate for Sinn Féin in the by-election. So we're seeing that connection between, again, De Valera and place and the Republican movement. And then we're seeing, of course, Pray for Ash, a fallen comrade, which is relating to Tomás Ash, who died on hunger strike on the 25th of September 1917. And immediately after his death, you see this crystallization of republicanism right across the country. And you see again that play out as a loyalty to memory and a further consolidation of feeling across the country, which is going, I believe, and does play out over the following War of Independence years. So to talk through and to move into the War of Independence period more generally, it's important, I think, to reflect on the level of change that took place around the country. And, you know, the RIC as the standing police force at that time, you know, they would have, of course, felt the change most dramatically, because it's very difficult for us, actually, I think, to appreciate the level of change that took place during the War of Independence for the general public. You know, when you look at the whole judicial system is transformed, you know, with the establishment of Sinn Féin courts, the whole boycott of the police, particularly from April 1919, but prior to that, you know, the relationship had been breaking down. Not to mention the level of violence that took place, obviously, across the country, as I'll explain in a little while. But just to very briefly explain, going to 1917 again, 2 quotes from the county inspector of the RIC in Clare. In May, he's saying the county is quiet, and by October, he's saying Sinn Féin is the law of the land. So this is the level of transformation that is taking place at this time. And that type of change in a society burns itself into the psyche. Okay, we're going through a pandemic now, and you know, there is change and there is an experience that we've not had before. So we're getting some sense of that as a society, but I personally don't think it's anything like what it's not comparable to what we're talking about here. But in terms of, you know, such a rapid transformation of the way in which society works, maybe there's something there to relate to it with. And so I'm going to play this piece for you now, because I want to talk about the introduction of the Black and Tans and the way in which that affected the experience. Now, the question in this piece of audio relates to the Black and Tans. The answer does not, because it relates to Tomás Mac Conmara and his murder by the RIC. And of course, it was the RIC that murdered Tomás Mac Conmara, not the Black and Tans, who had only been introduced the following week into the country. But I'll come back to that categorization and discussion around names in a little while. But it's from, what I'm going to play now is from the Cork Folklore Project. It's an interview with a woman called Mary O'Donovan in the north side of Cork City in 1996. It's an old recording. The audio is not fantastic, but I have the subtitles in so you can hear what she's saying. But she's speaking about working with Tomás Mac Conmara the evening that he's murdered. So it's a really powerful, important piece of audio. Again, only about 1.5 minutes long.
And can you tell me some things about the Black and Tans, what they did?
Oh, don't be talking, girl. They done terrible things. First of all, you know, they shot Tomás Mac Conmara.
Right.
You know that, don't you?
I do.
Yeah. I was working with him at the time. And that night, he was in the shop selling flour and meal himself inside the counter. And I was like in the month of March, you know. And I was going out. It was kind of getting dull and it was misty. And I was going out. The factory was at the back of the shop that I told you. And I was going out anyway. I was finishing off an order or something myself. And I was going out. And this man was singing outside the shop door. Better to do around that time, you know, now. And I was going out the door. And Tomás, there are some mercy in him now. He called me back. And he said, give that to the poor fellow sing outside the door. I know there was 6 or a shilling he gave me now. He gave me something to hand it to the poor singer outside the door. And I did, you know, now. And he was singing, left the green flag around me, boys. That's the song he was singing.
Right.
He was singing that song, but I handed him that nigger outside the door. It was quite a coincidence, wasn't it? It was during the night. That night he was murdered. His wife was expecting a baby, so she had twins after. The same night, in our presence and all, they shot him dead.
So again, I think a really powerful piece of audio, in my opinion, but really important because for 2 reasons. First, as I said, it was the RIC that shot Tomás Mac Conmara, not the Black and Tans. You know, that's really important because often, you know, people maybe in my view overemphasize the miscategorization. It's something a lot of historians get kind of caught up with, where they say that, oh, the Black and Tans have been blamed for this and blamed for that. And in fact, it was the auxiliaries or the RAC or whatever. And of course, we have to be as accurate as we can. But in my view, having undertaken hundreds of interviews on the subject, you know, in local areas all across the country, I really feel that there is, you know, a subtlety of understanding and a nuance in community memory, whereby, in fact, the use of the term Black and Tans isn't inaccuracy. It's actually reflective of the broad categorization of the forces of that time. And I've questioned several people on, you know, was it the Black and Tans or not? And, you know, it's not blasé of them, but they you know, frequently made the point that they saw little distinction. You know, they were able to discern between the RIC, of course, they knew many of them, and the Black and Tans, who they would know by their accents, etc., and their uniform. And also they would have been able to discern between them and the auxiliaries. But they also reflected the fact that in many cases, these organizations worked together, and in all cases, they were part of the same allied forces. So I think some historians get caught up on a misinterpretation that's not actually there, you know, and if they went down to the local areas, they would find out that people know full well, in most cases, who actually they're referring to, in most cases, as I say. And the indelible nature of that experience is really important. And, you know, for people who lived through it in particular, and there was a really useful quote that was given by Rudolph Fielding, the man on the left-hand side, who was, you know, certainly an unusual man to illustrate an insight into the Irish experience. But he did so in 1920, and his quotation was quoted in the House of Commons and published in the British press. But he said as follows: "What hope is there of peace in Ireland when the whole of Ireland is in this condition and every child goes to bed at night in terror, hearing shots and seeing murders? These ineffaceable and indelible memories will make them enemies of our country for the whole of their lives." Now, I think that's a very useful reflection on the nature of the experience and the way in which it did stay with people. And I think when we consider that, you know, I've interviewed many people who were children at the time, and I'm not saying that they were bitter towards the end of their lives, but certainly you could feel the anger was there. That remained, that endured, the sense of injustice. And some of it would be based on what we could characterize as very, you know, simple experiences. And, you know, but when you know, a foreign force, you know, be it comprising of Irish men or Black and Tans, nevertheless, it was a force that was seen as attempting to maintain British rule. When they come into your farm and shoot cattle, you know, when they come into your home, obviously, and smash your home up, or when they burn your home or burn your neighbor's home, those types of experiences remain embedded in the psyche and in the consciousness. And certainly when murders take place, of course, that lingers even more deeply within the feelings of the people. But I think, you know, we have to consider the nature of the war, the nature of the experience being so localized, when in actual fact the British Empire came to the doors of people in this context. We often see wars as a conventional experience whereby people are sent to other parts of the world, and, you know, and there's tremendous, like World War I, there was tremendous death and suffering, etc., and thousands of Irish people experienced that. But in the context of the War of Independence, the war is coming literally, you know, not metaphorically, but literally to the doors of people. You know, in my rural townland of Ballymalone, the war was there, you know, and it right across the country, be you in Laois or Mayo or Cork, wherever you were, very few places that the war didn't come to each and every community in some way. And the vortex of experience that the war was drew the entire community into it. Active, passive, you know, supporters or opponents were all part of that experience in one way or the other. So we have to attend to the nature of that experience. I always mention a great influence on me, and I'll explain why. But this letter, I've used it many, many times at this stage, but I think it's really important to show how we can connect with the period very simply. But the letter was written in December 1920 in Chicago and was sent back to West Clare. And it was written by an Irish immigrant who, on the top left-hand corner, you can see she describes how everybody in the church shed tears. This morning, the papers are full of the burning of Cork. So we clearly know what has happened, and we know about the experience of the burning of Cork was very traumatic for the people there. But for Irish people and Irish Americans, hearing about it, it was equally, well, it mightn't have been equally, but it was certainly traumatic for those people as well. And there was tremendous feeling and anger in America for what was happening in Ireland at the time. But I want to draw your attention to the bottom right-hand corner of the same letter, where you can see she says, "Mary, I am sending a little present and to the baby, just a little reminder." Now, this was written December 1920. The little baby is a girl called Catherine Maroney. She's 4 years of age, and 96 years later, little Catherine passed away. One of the greatest friends I'll ever have in my lifetime. I met her when she was 90 and we became great friends. I recorded her over those 10 years until she passed away at the age of 100. But Catherine remembered being a 4-year-old girl, and she remembered the black and tans. She remembered the experience. She remembered the feelings of it. And even though she was just 4 years of age, she wasn't able to, offer historical detail. But she was able to offer emotion and feeling and experience. And also she was able to chronicle the way in which that experience was remembered. She was able to chronicle the interruptions to that memory in terms of the Civil War. She was able to remember the fact that her husband, her future husband, Sean, was an IRA man in the 1940s that was interned for 3 years in the Curragh. She was able to remember the 70s when the troubles broke out in the north of Ireland and the experience of it and how it affected people's discussions at a public level, even about stuff like the War of Independence. So Catherine's contributions to my research are enduring and, really reinforce the value of people during that time. So to again underline the nature of the war and how it affects memory, in 1920 alone, we know there were over 45,000 raids, 45,474 raids in private homes across the country. That's 1920 alone. And some of those homes would have been raided multiple times, of course. It was the same homes, but there were still that many raids by British forces. So each one of those raids brings with it an experience and brings with it a memory. And, those memories don't die very easily, as I've said. And those raids happen right across the country. In most of those raids, the IRA volunteers who might have been the target weren't actually there. So it was the young women, old men left behind who had to suffer the consequence of those raids. But that's how you build this diffusion of experience right across at least the active areas of the country. And that brings with it this really solid foundation of memory and experience that, has to be there and has to be part of the way we interpret that time and understand that time by going back to that memory and by exploring it. And I want to play this next piece, which again, you won't need any subtitles for, but it's from a lady called Nora Canavan, and Nora was 104 years of age when I interviewed her. So Nora was 12 during the period of the War of Independence, and remembered it quite clearly, obviously. Interestingly, Nora's family weren't actively involved in the Republican movement. They would have been passively supportive, but certainly not a safe house, not an IRA family, but still experienced the time. And when I interviewed her at the age of 104, you can hear, as you'll hear now, the sense of it even in her breathing, in my view, not to mind her words. She refers to a young boy, the Murphys, in her piece of audio, which I'll come back to in a little while. So first she talks about generally the experience of that time, and secondly she talks about the Munreal ambush, which took place on the 18th of December 1920, very close to her own family home.
I know the time of the 10th, it was an awful time. God, you wouldn't know the hour of the night. They'd knock on the door and they'd come in and search your house, and if there was a spark of light seen, the windows had to be barricaded, covered up, no light to be seen. And that boy, the Murphys, who we were talking of the last day, that was very sad. Wasn't it sitting down reading a book that he was when he was shot through the window? Oh, God, it took an awful effect on them, it did. My father's health broke down that time. Oh, you'd be afraid of your life, sure. And the 10 or 12 lorries go from Ennis-Diamond down to Ennis every morning. And they'd be banging shots at both sides. Oh, I remember the evening before we came in from school, I remember my father and mother, there wasn't a word out of them. And they didn't tell us anything. But we knew in the morning what was wrong. And we were all collected into one room in case they'd any shots come through the windows or the doors. The stone walls were the safest. And my father had to go to see the cattle, and he was on his way back. And he went and sheltered from a shower, and there was a bullet put through the tree where he was, over his head. Oh my, it was a bad time.
So I just want again to underline there, and I've said this before about Nora, you know, in her breathing there, I think you get a sense of that time. So again, often, you know, she took us right to that ambush. You know, she took us to the sound of it. She took us to the danger of it. You know, all of that is encapsulated in her recollection. But, you know, some people would suggest maybe that it doesn't add to the historical detail, and, you know, maybe there's a point there. But certainly, as I've mentioned already, you know, if that doesn't give you a sense, that for me anyway gives a much better sense of that experience than any, you know, conventional report on the ambush might do, or at least in line with it, it is hugely useful in my view. So I'm going to play two more pieces of audio now, and then I'll move towards the kind of handling of the memory after the War of Independence, and, you know, how it was affected, what influenced it, and how it endured generally as we come towards the end of it. But the next piece is returning to our friend Archie. Again, you know, this is the second time Archie's voice has ever been heard publicly since it was recorded. And again, thanks to the Military Archives and Daniel Iotis, the OC there, for giving such a commitment really to putting the Mac Owen collection, to processing it, and to ensuring that it's available to the public. It's a massive service for the country, and you know, really good sign of the archives to take in that material and to make it available as well. So here again, you're going to hear Archie talking about the experience from his perspective, I suppose, of being a black and tan, traveling with auxiliaries, and in this case, leading into an ambush. He laughs at the start about picking Cork as an area to go to, and the consequences of that. So again, the subtitles are there because Archie is a little difficult to understand, but about a minute and a half long again, and we'll be back then.
Anyway, tell me what happened when you got into the black and tan.
I picked Cork.
What?
I picked Cork to go to. I thought it was a nice, quiet place.
Tell me what happened.
Well, I volunteered for Cork. And on our way down with a bloody Oxy, you know, they never wouldn't pass a bloody pub.
Yeah.
We were all bloody drunk. And when we left that pub in Macron, bloody Oxys, and they were all as full as bloody eggs with booze. And suddenly, from both sides of the road, it wasn't that, but it was getting that. A bloody rifle fire started.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we all hopped out and we were going to do this and we were going to do that. But instead of that, like, my belly was in bloody Irish mud. And you see, we couldn't see where the firing was. All we could see was the flash of rifle fire.
So there's an experience of a black and tan being ambushed by the IRA, and you know, it's unusual to hear that insight. You know, I've listened to the full interview with Archie. It's not a very long interview, but it is interesting, you know, to get an insight of, to get a voice first of all, get an insight into the type of people who joined the Black and Tans. He reveals himself that he joined the Black and Tans in order to kill another Black and Tan, and that who was a fellow Glaswegian like himself. And there was no political ideology certainly behind it, but I would say a preparedness to do damage without question, and a distaste for Irish people as well was very clear throughout the interview too. But again, just to understand that experience, it's interesting to see it because, you know, we hear there the experience of being ambushed. We know it's the IRA ambushing them. We also know then there's a consequence for the broader community around that ambush site. You know, like with Nora Canavan a little earlier, you know, the broader community experiences it, even though the actual confrontation might be between the British forces and the Republican movements. The second last piece I'm going to play tonight is from a man called Michael O'Gorman, great historian, great form still in Scariff and East Clare, and a great bearer of tradition. But he had a very powerful story about his grandfather, who had been a British soldier, by the way, and his granduncle, Michael Young, as well, and how they encountered a group of Black and Tans, you know, who didn't contain Archie Armstrong because he was in a different part of the country, but might well have contained people like Archie Armstrong. So I'll play Michael, again, a short piece, but gives an insight into, you know, the experience of that time, the brutality of it, the way in which it's linked to place, the way in which it's linked to family tradition, and the way in which the memory passes on in different ways.
The evening that Helens beat up my grandfather and my granduncle Michael. Michael was his brother-in-law.
That's Michael Young, isn't it?
Michael Young, yeah. When they were coming home, they were coming up the Fecal Road, there near Michael McMahon's. The Tens were actually on their way down the Fecal Road. They struck my grandfather into the face with a butt of a rifle and smashed his jaw. And I hammered him and kicked him while he was on the ground. But Michael tried to help him, and I struck Michael with the butt of a rifle, and when Michael fell, one of them stood, you know, his arm went out like that, you know, and one of them stood on him. It stood on his arm, and another stood on his back. And they got the butt of the rifle, and they smashed his arm again and again and again with the butt of the rifle. And when I was a little lad, I used to spend a lot of my time with my granduncle. I used to notice his arm, even when he hadn't his sleeves turned up, which was like a sickle, like that. The doctors were never able to get his arm straightened out. They were able to save it all right, you know, but they could never get it straight, so that his arm was bent over like a sickle. The evening.
So that's Michael O'Gorman, as I say, and you know, a very clear, you know, strong sense of what happened to his granduncle and his grandfather, the connection of that event to place, and the physical, you know, legacy of it in his granduncle's arm and the way it was bent up like a sickle, as he said himself. You know, that type of experience would be typical right across the country, and you know, we're foolish to think that those events and those experiences don't play out in communities and play out in community memory. And they're a very real part of that time and a very real part of that experience. You know, so again, as I've said before, and I'll say again, to get back down to the level of the townland, you know, or the street, is where we have to go to find this history, and to like that experience of the man we're looking at here. This photograph was taken in County Clare during a period of martial law when the British Army were patrolling the areas. It's in North Clare, but it's you know, again, a typical enough experience of that time, you know, and rural roads around the country. There are many different dimensions that I've had to try and grapple with over the years, you know, in relation to exploring, you know, memory at a broad level, And in my view, one of the most important, if not the most important dimension of memory is silence. And that's both at a community level and at a private level or an individual level. You know, unless you are aware and attend to the silences and what's not said as much as what is said, then you don't understand memory, in my view. And silence manifests in many, many different ways. Sometimes it's the trauma that doesn't allow, you know, the story to be revealed. I have the example of the Murphy boy that Nora, if you remember, that Nora Canavan mentioned earlier on, related to Francie Murphy, who in August 1919 was shot dead at his home in Glan outside of Innistimon. And the findings at the time were that it was a British military unit that fired in through the window. They were certainly active in the area at the time. 2 RIC men had been shot dead in the weeks beforehand in the same area. Francie was known to be a member of Fianna Éireann and had worn the uniform publicly, and the shots were fired in through the window. Now, there is another contention that it may have been to do with land, but certainly the young boy who was 15 years of age was dead nonetheless. And his sister, who in the photograph, the family photograph that's there, happened to be beside him, was the girl who held him as he died that night. Now, that was in 1919. I spoke to Francie's nephew and Una, his sister's son, in 2011. And he recalled how in 1965, 46 years after Francie's death, he was at his mother's side in a hospital in North Clare as she was dying. And in the second day of a coma, she managed to wake up from the coma and just moved enough to get the rosary beads, which were behind her in the bed. She kissed the rosary beads, and this is in front of my interviewee, and she kissed the rosary beads, looked to the foot of the bed, and said, "Francie, Francie, Francie." She lay back down, she fell asleep, went back into a coma, and passed away the following day. For 46 years, as my interviewee explained, she had never mentioned Francie once. She'd mention him once a year, say a decade of the rosary for him, and that's it. Wouldn't talk about him for 46 years. But the last 3 words she said on this earth were to call her brother's name 3 times. So again, silence can be, a measure to protect oneself against trauma, or something that's just too difficult to remember. And sometimes communities can have that capacity to conceal as well, rather than to deal with something. And that's maybe part of the way communities and people work. But it's there. The other, of course, silence is often talked about is women. And it's talked an awful lot about. And, you won't find a stronger advocate for the role of women during the revolutionary period than me. And I know I've spoken before to Liz Gillis about this, and she's done a tremendous amount on obviously on all areas of the period, but on women as well. But I think it is wrong to present this notion, and it's repeated, and of course it's kind of popular to say it, but it's constantly mentioned that women were written out of the story and they were never acknowledged. And that is true at a certain level in which history is written. When you go to the national level, yes, women were written out. But you go down to the local memory and you talk to people locally about the experience of the revolutionary period, and you can be guaranteed they'll know the names of Cuimhneamh who were involved in their local area. And they know the role of Cuimhneamh, and they know the role of other women, in different aspects as well. When it came to official recognition, or certainly in terms of the official narrative or the state narrative, there was a big gap in relation to the role of women outside of the key figures like Maud Gonner or Countess Markievicz. But I think it's wrong to say that they're completely neglected, because at a local level they weren't. At a local level they were recognised, and certainly by their comrades in the IRA they were recognised. But somewhere along the line, the state as an entity felt or decided in its way that women weren't going to be recognised at that level. But the images, just very quickly, reflect in some ways the silence that can be there, even self-imposed silence. But in the top left-hand corner, the top left-hand image, you see Mike O'Foley, an IRA volunteer from Ennis, and his girlfriend at the time, who was from Clonlara in South East Clare, and Kathleen McCormack was her name. As they went on, they got married, they had a family in Ennis, and I interviewed their daughter, who's up in the top right-hand corner. And at the end of the interview, having spoken about her father for some time, she revealed that her mother wasn't really involved, or she felt she wasn't really involved. But to make a long story short, we subsequently found a collection of documents that revealed that her mother, Kathleen, who you see in the bottom of the picture as an old woman, was the second from the top in Cuimhneamh across the East Clare Brigade, and was deeply involved in carrying guns, in helping wounded IRA volunteers, etc. But had spoken, she had not spoken about it in all of her life subsequent to that. So, moving on very quickly, and I'm sure Liz and Michal are watching the clock, but we're getting towards the end. But I want to talk about the ways in which it has been, the different ways, the different triggers for that memory over the decades that followed, and how it was affected by different events that took place. The physical, legacy is there right across the country. There would be family memorabilia, which plays a really important role for families and for communities, but particularly for families, when a physical piece of memorabilia, be it a gun or something else, can play such an important role. I've spoken before about finding a gun myself in my own townland when I was about 10 years of age, and found it in a derelict cottage, buried in the ground, and took it home, minded it, and unfortunately, as I say, either my brother or other visitors took it, to my constant heartbreak. I've never been able to find it since, but it was there. It was in my townland. It was there in the ground, the same way that they are all over the country. But it could be like a ring here made by Michael J. Crimmins in Ballykinler internment camp. It could be a dugout on a farm in some part of the country. This is a man called John O'Connell, 92 years of age, who on that day I took the photograph of him, was on his way to show me a point in his own landscape where he had known there was a dugout. Now the dugout was gone, it was covered over, now it was just a piece of land being grazed by cattle. But he knew where it was, and that point in the landscape for him was a really important connection to that period, to the involvement of his uncle, and to the connection of his own landscape to that period of Irish history. This photograph is taken from underground in a different dugout in a different part of West Clare. And again, this is where we see physical part of the landscape reminding us of this period, and the way in which people interacted with the landscape around them, the way in which they knew the landscape, and that was a critical part of their advantage during that time, but it's part of the legacy as well. We have here a very poignant example of what can be left in the landscape from that time. I had interviewed a man called Michal O'Connell here. What you're looking at here, by the way, is a Huggerland all-terrain vehicle which came to North Clare in 2018 to exhume a body. That body was that of a British soldier, a member of the 2nd Royal Scots. And back in 2009, I'd interviewed Michal O'Connell, who you see in front of you, and Michal had spoken about, as he described it, a tan that was buried in the bog above the mountain above him. And he explained how, over the years, he'd always known about it, and different people had disbelieved it, and, etc. But the site of the alleged body was always taken care of to an extent, even though it was part of a Republican area, even though the 2nd Royal Scots had been very violent. There was a certain respect given to the fact that a human being was believed to be there. Subsequently, when it was established by the OPW and others and the British Commonwealth Graves Association, they came with the Gardaí, etc., and exhumed the body and took it away and buried it in Grange Gorman. George Duff Chalmers was the name of the young soldier who was 18, nearly 19 years of age when he was captured by IRA and executed. But he had not been officially listed. He had not been officially listed anywhere. So the only place it was known where his body was within the community memory in North Clare. And again, it was a really powerful example of the value of memory in that context, in terms of keeping the knowledge of where that young man was buried, and led, thankfully, in the context of his family, of course, and years later in his proper burial up in Dublin, in Grange Gorman. So the last couple of slides, I'm just going to move past these because I know time is moving on very quickly. I wanted to talk very briefly about the Lucknahan Brothers in South Galway. Now, it's known all over the country. I'm sure people know about the story of the Lucknahan Brothers. The Scariff Martyrs I've just moved past is my next book. I'm not going to talk about it in great detail, obviously, but the Lucknahan Brothers only happened about 10 days after the Scariff Martyrs were murdered on the bridge of Killaloe. But certainly the murder of the Lucknahan Brothers was the most brutal I've encountered, certainly in the War of Independence, in terms of the way in which they were treated. But what I want to say is that, you know, and sometimes the stories can be so brutal that it would be difficult to believe them. Now, the next image I'm going to show you, some people have seen them, some people won't, some people might find it difficult to look at, but it is actually the bodies of the Lucknahan Brothers in their coffins in Shanaglis in Galway. Now, I believe firmly that if those photographs hadn't been taken, then, you know, despite the trust you'd have in memory and tradition, I think it would be difficult to believe the stories that were told about what happened to the two young men, but the bodies bore the imprint of the brutality that was inflicted on them during that episode in late November 1920. And it's an illustration also of the, you know, the way in which conventional information, you know, the British military court of inquiry that was held in relation to this presents the story that the men tried to escape, and that they escaped their custody. And they even backed that up during that time by raiding the Lucknahans' home after they had murdered them. So again, you know, we should exercise tremendous caution when we're looking at conventional sources, irrespective of where they come from, but we have to be cautious of all sources, of course. But the Lucknahan Brothers is a very powerful story in that context. So just to want to, as I say, briefly reflect on the kind of the landscape of memory and the battle for the narrative as can be described across the decades that followed. And I'll be finished in about, I'd say, 5 to 10 minutes. You know, when you're talking about the memory of the Irish War of Independence, you can't ignore the Civil War, of course, because it is a key mediation point for many people in terms of how they feel about the War of Independence. You know, for the general public, it's a lot easier to talk about the War of Independence. It'll be interesting, of course, to see what happens next year when we get into the centenary of the Civil War. But the experience is very traumatic for many people. You know, we're looking at an image here of Charlie Daly on the right-hand side, who was, of course, from Kerry, but was executed in Donegal by the Free State during the Civil War. And his sister, Mia Dalig, was interviewed by Tomás Mac Conmara and spoke about it, and spoke about, you know, the continuing Republican commitment they had in their family and the Free State raids on her home. And even at one point remembered praying in her home while the Free State were raiding it, looking for Republicans. Now, this is after Charlie had been killed, and she was inside praying to Charlie that the Republicans wouldn't be found in the dugout above their home during that time. So, you know, the Civil War leaves such a print on the psyche within communities that it can't be, I suppose, understated in terms of how it affects the memory. Partition of the country is a force for the preservation of memory, because the reality is that the fact that the 6 counties were held under British rule subsequent to the War of Independence left that nature of an unfinished business. Of course, for the people in the north of Ireland, it left them under British rule, and we know the consequences of all of that. I think this is an interesting conversation, which obviously I won't be going into in detail now, but certainly the partitioning of the country, even though for us in the south, you know, we had gained, you know, a measure of independence, and, you know, all was fine to a degree. But the fact that there was a partitioning, the fact that there was still British rule in the country, meant that for generations that followed, there was a continuing IRA presence, there was a continuing relevance in that sense to IRA commemoration, to IRA memory, and to Republican memory. And that plays a role in the War of Independence, because there's an investment in the memory of the War of Independence by following generations of the Republican movement from the 40s through into the 70s. And that keeps a relevance to the War of Independence. So the partition of the country, the ongoing nature of that, the continuing British rule in the 6 counties, has a role in the way in which we look at the War of Independence, for sure. There are striking incidents right across the country. We're looking here at Joseph Mary Plunkett and Grace Gifford, and I interviewed the niece of this lady here, Nan Hogan, who was a senior member of Cuimhneamh. She was the head of the East Clare Brigade of Cuimhneamh. Now, Nan took the anti-treaty side, Grace Gifford took the anti-treaty side, and they were both in the same cell together. And Grace drew an image of the, you'll see here, Cuimhneamh Jail Chapel, where she married Joseph Mary Plunkett. She took a window, a pane of glass, I should say, from the window of Cuimhneamh Jail and used it for the frame and presented that to Nan Hogan. It's still in the family. I've seen it. You can see it there in front of you now. So you see those connections, and we can't forget that Grace Gifford, of course, took the anti-treaty side and was jailed, even though she was the widow of a 1916 leader. That continues on, and which I'll come back to in a second. But you know, commemoration becomes really important. The 1916 Rising becomes important because we start to see an emerging national memory, particularly when Fianna Fáil get into power. We see them, you know, tightening a grip on that story and claiming territory of memory. The death of Cuchulainn is commissioned. Oliver Shepherd creates it on the obstruction of Eamon de Valera as symbolic of the Easter Rising of 1916. In the same year, 1941, the Silver Jubilee of the Easter Rising is held. The same year, the 1916 medal is presented for the first time. The year after that, the 1917-21 service medal is presented. And this is all against the backdrop of ongoing IRA activity. So you're seeing a competing memory now from ongoing activists and people who had been involved who were claiming the memory as well for themselves. But at the same time, and I was again spent so much time listening back to the Mac Conmara collection, there were 1,000 Republicans interned in the Curragh internment camp by the state. The Emergency Powers Act is passed by Jerry Boland, and after Sean Russell's declaration of war on England, and you see 1,000 Republicans interned. You see amongst those Republicans Jack Plunkett, who's the brother of Joseph Mary Plunkett. Now, a bizarre scene takes place in Easter 1941, where at Arbour Hill, a commemoration to Joseph Mary Plunkett is taking place, which the state are running. Inside Arbour Hill is Jack Plunkett on hunger strike, his brother. So, you know, you have these striking moments taking place that are forming this continuing chain of activism and memory and activism, and the confrontations between all of those are very interesting. Throughout the decades that followed, you had an ongoing, you had kind of an increasing memorialization taking place. You had, you know, monuments were installed all over the country to fallen Republicans, particularly in the 40s, becomes a real high point of installation of monuments, be it Sinn Féin, be it more state orientated, be it Fianna Fáil orientated, but there are monuments being installed all of the time. We're seeing an increase in even cinema. 1926, George Dewhurst is the first person to produce a film, Irish Destiny, on War of Independence. Tom Cooper's The Dawn, you know, Frank O'Connor's Guest of the Nation. All these are produced in the cinema. So we're seeing more even cinematic portrayal of the War of Independence for the general public. They're seeing monuments installed. They're hearing songs sung. There's newspaper coverage, you know, all of the time on either commemorations, on something to do with the anti-partition movement, tributes to IRA men who died, or Cuimhneamh women. Dorothy McCardle publishes her book, The Irish Republic in 1937. So we're seeing throughout the 30s and 40s and 50s this real prevalence of the story of the War of Independence right across the country. Brendan Behan joked at one stage that he had to duck when he opened the paper. There was so much lead flying across the pages at one point. So we are seeing a continuing presentation of the story, even though it's contested at different levels by different competing groups. We're seeing an attempt to document, you know, which of course I'm really, really interested in. The state plays a really important role in terms of the Bureau of Military History, the military service pensions collection, which of course wasn't a historical collection exercise, but now becomes a real insight or a window into that time. We see Ernie O'Malley undertaking a personal collection, significant work in the 40s, which subsequently gave us a great insight into many people. We see Father Louis O'Kane, and we see other private collectors who have documented memory over the years, which all play a massive role in our understanding of that broader period. In my view, and I'm coming to the last slide, in my view, and the reason I brought that image up is that I think within that local memory where we can access it, be it previously collected material or be it, you know, memory that has come to us in tradition. You know, I've said it already tonight, but is of such value to our understanding of the past. And in my ambition in history is not to become, you know, massively knowledgeable so that I can recall dates or names at any moment. It's not really to become this fantastic analyst of history either. I mean, I want to be able to analyze, I want to be able to recall, but fundamentally I want to understand the past. And that's always been my ambition. And I've always felt that you could, you know, you could meet somebody, you know, a professor of history and, you know, could have spent, you know, tremendous time researching and analysing, but, you know, and listen to their version of the past. But you could go down to Kerry or to Tipperary and you could meet a man leaning on over the gate, you know, who could have more of an insight into that time. He mightn't have the analysis, he mightn't have the huge amount of data, but he has the understanding of what took place in his area. And in my view, unless we, you know, put our ear to those people and get down on the ground and listen and gather up the fragments of memory that's left, we're not going to get a true version of the past, or certainly not going to get a true version of the experience of the past. So the last piece I want to play for you is from a man called Jimmy Gleeson, who unfortunately has passed away as well. But Jimmy was from West Clare, from a place called Coor, a great traditional music house, Gleeson's of Coor. Some of you will know, I'm sure. But Jimmy's father, Ned, was a member of the IRA in that area. And Jimmy grew up with a great understanding of it, you know, from listening to people, from listening to IRA volunteers, as well as our former IRA volunteers, also from listening to his dad. But I asked him to kind of give a characterization of the IRA men and the stories he heard from that time towards the end of a recording I did with him about 10 years ago. So I'll play his piece and we'll finish it at that. And if there's any questions, then I'll be delighted to try and answer them. So here's Jimmy Gleeson.
They were, outside of my father now, in general, they were a tough race of people. And I have done a fair bit of travelling in my time. And I would say they were a unique race of people. They were tough. They could go for a long time. How would you say, without food and stuff, and they didn't expect too much. And I would say one thing from, there's a body of men there and a photograph in a parade. I would like to have them behind me if I was in a tight corner. They weren't afraid of anything. And on top of that, too, they weren't maybe the nicest people in the world to their wives and families. They were kind of born wild, if you like. But they were harming, real harming. I remember going to fairs with him in Milltown, like, you know, it was damn seldom you came out of a fair without a row. And they didn't go back from anybody.
Did you ever see your own father in a row at a fair?
Oh, I saw him a few times in action. And they could handle themselves, let's put it that way.
Did he maintain his kind of Republican beliefs? You know?
Right to the last. Right to the last.
So that was Jimmy Gleeson, as I say, and look, I've kind of rushed through an awful lot of stuff there, but hopefully it gives you a sense of where I'm coming from in terms of my research, and obviously, yeah, the value of memory, the value of including it, and I don't disagree with, I don't go against conventional sources. I use them all the time myself in my research, but it's just about having an ear to the experience on the ground as close as you can to it to bring about a better understanding of all that time. I think is really, really important. So look, it's been a pleasure, as I said, to present for you. Hopefully it made sense and you could at least hear it. So I'll hand it back to Liz and Michal, or Liz or Michal, whoever wants to wants to talk next.
Right, Tomás, thank you so much for that. That was incredible. Hand you over now to Liz, who can take it on from here.
Okay, well, first of all, Tomás, thank you. I knew this was going to be an amazing talk, and the comments that are coming in, I'm really trying to multitask on a phone, a tablet, and the computer to cope with all the comments and questions that are coming in. Good. First of all, just amazing comments about the presentation. Fantastic, brilliant, very emotive. We've had people tuning in from Argentina, Ballina, Belfast, hey Francie, all across Ireland, and everyone is just saying the same thing. Just amazing. Right, I'm just going to go through. Oh, and America as well. I'm going to go through some of the questions. I noted some of them down. So, Liam Shortall asked, was it Cathal O'Shannon that interviewed Dan, if you know?
No, it was Uachtarán Mac Conmara. It was Uachtarán, like Cathal did a lot of great interviews, but no, the Uachtarán Mac Conmara interviewed 102 people, well, 102 interviews for his research in the 80s, 70s and 80s. So no, it was Dan. Now, Cathal might have interviewed Dan on another occasion, but certainly it was Uachtarán in the interview I used there. It was definitely Uachtarán Mac Conmara.
Okay, and Patrick Kilfeather asked, oh no, he has a comment, a Civil War recollection. In Waterford in the Comores, houses once known as safe houses of because of their support during the War of Independence. Sadly, during the Civil War, cooked the bad bacon to send out the sour smell as a signal, you're no longer welcome here.
Yeah, I mean, there was such a change in that time. Like it's very, very difficult to get to grips with how much it changed. And of course, the real difficulty was almost turning around what I've been saying earlier in terms of the way in which the IRA had the advantage of knowing their landscape, you know, knowing their community, they were embedded in that community. And that, of course, then went against the anti-treaty IRA because the Free State or the local people connected to the Free State knew the area just as well as anywhere else. There's an example of it, and it's not a trivial example, but in West Clare, there was a dog. Would you believe this? There was a small monument put up to a dog for a time in West Clare. He had been renowned in the War of Independence as a great sort of a signal when the British forces were coming. But during the Civil War, the Free State, who knew this, shot him, you know, and it's that level of knowledge of knowing that, you know, the dog belonging to the O'Donnells in Tullycrine had been used as a signal, and they went and shot him. So, you know, that intimate knowledge, of course, was turned against the anti-treaty. And then it's very, very difficult because you have, in the War of Independence, you know, this building force of the people against British rule. And then in the Civil War, you have this shift where all the Irish institutions, the church, the press, business, all go pro-treaty. So that makes it very, very difficult. It's almost going back to pre-1916. Like, people talk about 1916 and that the Irish people were changed by the execution of the Easter leaders. I don't buy that. I think that there was a feeling was always there under the surface pre-1916, but the political environment was repressive and didn't allow people to express that. So you go back to the Civil War period, all the institutions of the state have now put their face against, or put their face with the Free State. So it's very, very difficult now for the people to go out against that, which when they might have done it against British rule and against all of that out there. But yeah, it's very, very difficult in some cases where you had support, you know, and then suddenly that's turned against you. And that's replicated right across the country in my experience.
Brilliant, Tomás. And again, I'm going to be going through questions and comments as they come in, because Facebook is just hopping all over the place. So Noel McGlynn, and I apologise if I pronounce your names wrong. Fantastic talk, a very interesting perspective about how the heart of the community was traumatised with consequences evident to this day. And this very much relates to the Civil War, Tomás, like how we're going to deal with commemorating the Civil War. It's going to bring up a lot of trauma.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, for sure. And I've thought a lot about it over the years. I've probably arrived at a situation where you know, I don't see much, like, I have no problem, no historians are supposed to be objective in that, and I don't believe in the objective historian. I believe in the honest historian. I believe in the credible historian. The historians who tell you they're objective are probably the least objective, you know. I just don't buy it. I mean, we all have feelings. We all have inherited emotions. We try and stand back from it as much as we can and be fair and be honest and be methodologically sound. But, you know, I don't see much to celebrate in partition, you know what I mean? I don't see much to celebrate in the way in which the Free State was created, you know. That's not to say I can't figure out an understanding of how it happened. And I think that's where we probably need to go in the Civil War, is to try our best to understand the environment in which those decisions were made. Now, we can consider the consequences of them quite clearly for partition, quite clearly for the nationalist community in the north of Ireland. We can see where we can, when we're in the south, we really need to see that and understand that. But in terms of the decisions that were made in the Civil War, I think it's better to try and understand how you've gone through a period of violence where, you know, killing someone has become easier, you know what I mean, to quite put it quite frankly. And then you have, you know, people turned against each other very, very quickly, very, very heated, very, very personal. And decisions are being made, you know, within all of that environment. And I think the more we try and understand it, I think that will be a better exercise than, you know, certainly for the state now. I think the state should have very little role in commemorating the Civil War. I think it should just support things like what you're doing to bring about a better discussion and understanding of it. The people will commemorate anyway. Local communities will commemorate anyway. And they've done it for 100 years. The state comes in and commemorates when it suits the state, but communities will do it anyway. The state should support a discovery, understanding, and an honest conversation about it, I think.
Brilliant. Lindy Taylor, hey Lindy, she said, we're a great nation for the stories. I've been hearing them all my life. How hard is it to separate the facts, what actually happened, from the tales? So I'll hand that over to you, Tomás.
Sure, Liz. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, it's like anything. You know, I have two ways of answering the question, right? Because of course you have to be aware when you're dealing with memory, what are the influences on memory? And I've tried to kind of shine a light on some of those, be it commemorations, be it songs. You look at any community and you look at the physical landscape of memory, be that monuments or memorials, you know, and there will be only a partial representation of what happened represented in those monuments. Like, there isn't a monument for everyone, there isn't a song for everyone. So there's a selectivity at all levels of recollection. And, you know, that's the same in terms of individual recollection. You know, they're never direct replications of what happened. They're always sort of fleshed in narrative and some selectivity, but there's always a value to them because they're always representative of the way in which a community has remembered, the way in which a family has inherited a story or has passed on a story. But the second answer to the question is that all sources have to be, you know, disentangled, because we know, like, look at the police sources, you know, from the War of Independence, and again, they're fierce valuable, and some of them are great, but they're coming from a force that are literally at war with the IRA, and they're writing about it, you know, and if that doesn't present a basis for some sense of bias, I don't know what does. Now, I'm not accusing them all of being mistruths, but you have to understand that that as a source, of course, has the potential for bias. You know, we see where reprisals take place and the county inspector is saying that strange men, you know, or unknown men came in and burned the whole of Balbriggan, you know. But equally then with the Bureau of Military History, we see a tremendous sort of a selective memory in a lot of the testimonies that are given to us in that documentation as well. So sometimes I kind of push back a little bit when people talk about memory and the potential for mistruth, because in all sources we have to be careful about it. But with memory, I think sometimes when we figure out the issues that are wrong or the gaps that are there, we can figure out why. And sometimes there's something revealing in that as well, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. And Tomás, again, just some comments. We have a wonderful history. Thank you for telling it. Jerry Cassidy, many thanks, Tomás, for a wonderful presentation. As a young man growing up in Derry at the outbreak of the Troubles, so much of what he described has affected me in my 60s. Thanks a million, Jerry, for that.
Can I just, just before you go off Derry there, because I know Derry fairly well, and I have great respect for Derry people, but in the Scariff Martyrs that I'm doing the book on next, they were buried on the 20th of November, Saturday the 20th of November 1920, and the day after that a man called John Mac was shot dead in Derry. He was a postman. He was shot dead by the British. And you know, I mention it because, you know, we often talk about the experience in Munster and, you know, Clare and Limerick and Tipperary, etc. But British forces were shooting people in Derry at the time. They were shooting them in Belfast at the time, you know, and the death of John Mac should be known as much as the death of the Scariff Martyrs or the death of Pater Clancy or whoever that might be. And I know as well what Jerry is saying about the Troubles and I suppose the similarity of experience, because it is just the same experience in a different time, you know, in terms of what actually took place. So I appreciate Jerry's comments and you know, empathize with them as much as I can.
Thanks for that, Tomás. Maura Murphy, hi Maura. I'm 65 and remember vividly my parents' stories of the Black and Tans. They were children during that time and they never forgot the constant fear that they lived in, and that comes totally across in the Time of the Tans, Tomás, your book. My dad was in Kerry and my mother in Kilkenny. Linda Taylor, another brilliant talk, very moving. Dermot Brannock, the Badaik resistance was a great story of resistance by men and in particular the women. Yeah.
There was 33 women jailed afterwards, Liz, you know, and again it's something that has to be mentioned. And we talk about Cuimhneamh and what I discussed the thing earlier on about it. But in the land war, the role of women was massively important. I mean, the Badaik evictions was really a fantastic example because we had the photographs of the Hollering sisters and all of that. But there was an example of, there was a Francis Mac Conmara, was one of the men, one of the houses evicted, and inside was his two sisters and a cousin, Joanne Kennedy. And Joanne Kennedy and Francis and the two sisters were beaten quite badly when the emergency men eventually got in. But Joanne came out, and this is 1887. She came out and gave a sort of a speech, which, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but which related to the fact that 36 years before that, her parents had been evicted by the landlord, John O'Callaghan. And she said, I'm glad that today I've given a bit back for it. So this is 1881, remembering what happened 36 years before that. And then in the 1920s, people are remembering, 1887, people are remembering 1887. So, you know, that injustice, the memory of it kind of comes to us across the generations, as I tried to mention there. But the Badaik evictions and the women and their role in it is absolutely critical, without question.
Brilliant, Tomás. And sorry, just more, it was just continuing that story. In the yard at my mother's home in Kilkenny, as the house was near the church, so many people left their horse and carts in our yard. Every Sunday, an older cousin would bemoan the fields across the view as she had been evicted from them.
Gosh, isn't that amazing?
We have, hello Maria Trey, she's tuning in from Cordoba in Argentina. Tola Collier, excellent presentation. Veronique, hello Veronique, tuning in from Paris. Anne Parsons Dunn, do you know Anne?
Mm.
Yeah, so Anne is tuned in, and Catherine Talty was our grandmother's first cousin. Thanks for tuning in, Anne. And now where are we? We also have Moira Talty has tuned in as well.
My great friend Moira. Moira is one of my great friends in this world. She's Catherine's daughter, and so important to me, and she knows that.
And sorry, and just and a bit more information about Anne Parsons Dunn. Her mother's family were from Clare, and she remembers the stories. Her maiden name is Mac Conmara. A question from John Shield. what kind of performance art, storytelling or song or theatre or whatever, which one has the greatest potential, in your opinion, to best convey this type of history to modern audiences?
Oh, that's a good question. I know John as well, a good friend of mine over in America. That's a really good question. I think, John, you know, if we can keep it as close to the voices of the people that we get it from, is the most powerful thing. I think the great story about the great thing about oral tradition, folklore, is that, you know, the minute it comes from the lips of an old man or woman, it's at its strongest, you know. And I suppose we've to step in and document it and record it now for other generations. And when we're trying to present it to the people, we need to keep as much of the force from the original telling as possible. So, you know, the performance art and the stage presentation is really, really good and really, really important. But I have a personal view that if we can retain as much of the original telling as possible, then that's important. Now, obviously, that recording of the voice is absolutely critical, because, you know, if you hear Nora Canavan's voice earlier on, you know, at the age of 104, it would be very difficult to more forcefully convey her sense of that time than it would be just to play her voice, you know. So I think if we have the recordings, if we have the words of those people, then we put them front and center of the way we tell it, and integrate that in different ways. There's obviously a huge amount of different ways that we can integrate, you know, material like that into, you know, digital storytelling or whatever, but retain the emotion and the voice from the people that tell the story, and keep that at the center of it, I think.
Brilliant. And again, just some comments. Thank you, Tomás. It's been a privilege to listen to you. That's from Noel Fleming. How are you, Noel? Martin Golden, thanks, Tomás. Maura was actually watching from Ballinan, Mayo. Aoife, and I apologise, Aoife Nikaxine. I'm not going to attempt the other part of your name, Aoife. I'm so sorry. Fascinating insight into the value of memory and stories. Thank you. Anne Parsons Dunn, she remembers the Gleasons well, Great place for music and dancing. Karina Walsh, excellent presentation, Tomás. Again, just fantastic presentation. That's Christina and Kieran are tuning in from America. Wonderful talk, fantastic presentation. Mark O'Brien, fantastic presentation. Thank you. Yes, great stuff, Tomás. Joseph Frayne has a comment. The despicable behaviour of the Tans, Augsies and RIC was mimicked throughout the country. Not much room for exaggerated stories. And would you agree with that, Tomás?
Yeah, I would. I think it's a really good point. And I think, again, it kind of speaks to the Lucknahan Brothers story, even though that was the worst thing in the world. But I mean, there would be, without those photographs, you know, there would be, I think, a lot of suggestions that couldn't be true, you know, what actually happened to them. And, you know, there was a sadism, but I've definitely made the point. I mean, and I grew up, as I say, in a townland that the Black and Tans raided. You know, I've inherited the same feelings towards them, and all the British forces, obviously, as most people have done. And I disagreed with the Charlie Flanagan's proposal last year publicly, obviously, about the RIC, as a lot of people did. But I've used the analogy before of the Black and Tans, or the British forces generally, being the edge of an axe head that's been wielded by the likes of Winston Churchill and Lloyd George and Hammer Greenwood. And I think, you know, sometimes it's not that we have a misplaced anger towards the Black and Tans. It's not misplaced at all, because they did the damage. But certainly a big portion of our anger should be directed back up towards the upper echelons of British rule, or the people who are making the decisions to send them over. Because again, look at Archie, look at our fellow Archie. As I said, Archie, I'd say, didn't give one damn about Ireland being free or not, you know, but saw an opportunity to get a job, didn't like Irish people, you know, was given a gun, was given free rein, wanted to kill somebody in the Black and Tans, as he declared himself, and off he went. And, you know, in the period of time he was in Ireland, was perfectly willing and capable of doing tremendous damage. But he was given that opportunity and was enabled by senior figures in British rule. And these are the Winston Churchills, you know, the one whose Hollywood movies made about him, you know, and the greatest Britain, you know, they're the ones that sent over the Black and Tans, and they're the ones that deserve, I think, the enmity maybe certainly as much as the actual British forces.
So maybe Carl Brewer was right in his plan to go and assassinate the members of the cabinet.
Maybe so, maybe so.
And again, just more comments. Thank you, Tomás. Well done, Tomás. Great passion in your voice. I believe you have a great feeling for the history of the OCC. He definitely does, Joseph. Myra Talty, thanks to Cara. Lovely remembering Grandaunt Mary Dorgan and of course Mum. Sorry, the occasion, that was Joseph's, the message that he was finishing. Pauline Matthews, fantastic stories and recordings, what a treasure trove. And Tomás, like, you literally have been collecting I know you used a lot of stuff from the Untitled Chapter collection, but you've been collecting this stuff from when you were a kid. Like, what triggered in your mind to go, I need to go out and interview these people?
Yeah, oh, for sure, Liz. Yeah, I mean, I would have started probably writing down old words and stuff. Like, it wasn't all, obviously, not all my collection is about the War of Independence. I record all sorts of stuff, but both of them started in my townland. I had an old neighbour called Jim Mac who died when I was 26. He was 99 years of age, and I would have been up and down to Jim every day since I was 8 years of age. And also, I was exposed to Jim as an old man. Jim wasn't even trying to tell me about history, but he was just a living embodiment of the past. And you know, couldn't read, couldn't write, but was tremendously wise and wiser than most academics I've met. But he just instilled in me an appreciation of older people and the value of their memory. But then, as I mentioned during the talk there, Liz, I used to be always looking at old houses and objects and stuff, just for whatever reason I was interested. But I found a revolver in an old derelict house. And for me, the more I've thought about it over the years, that was the perfect metaphor, because it was literally like buried in my townland, in the ground, in the landscape of my townland. And by finding it, I discovered that this war of this global significance was played out right in my townland and right across the country in townlands like that. And again, to follow the analogy, and I mentioned this in the book, that you need to go back down to that level to try and actually recover the story. So both of those things, as a very young teenager, child, you know, really just brought me to older people. And I used to go along with my father even and write down notes and stuff, and he'd be visiting older neighbours and people in his own place. And then it just went from that to getting a dictaphone and recording. And yeah, I've been doing it all my life and I love it. And you've met the greatest of people, you know, it's fantastic.
And it shows in your work, Tomás. And if anyone hasn't read Time of His Hands, I seriously cannot highly recommend that book enough, because you will laugh, you will cry, you literally feel like you are there witnessing history. And I know I'm not the only one that says that, Tomás.
Thanks, Liz.
So it's an amazing book, everyone. So do treat yourself to it. If you can actually get a copy of it now, because it was sold out, rightly so. Now, sorry, now some more comments coming in. Oh yes, sorry. So Mel McGowan, hey Mel, on selectivity of memory, does this common phrase and statements tell us much in your opinion? But I cannot think of their names at the moment.
Just give me that last bit of it, Liz, again.
So when people say, talking about a story, but then they say, I can't remember their name at the minute, is that they're deliberately forgetting, or it's selective, or it's just, you know?
Yeah. That's a really good question from Nell. I certainly, after a lot of years, and I think in oral history, you have to figure out people, and you have to try and understand body language. It takes a long time, and I don't know if you'll ever, like, I'm always learning, but you do start to figure out, you know, when you've done it a lot, when somebody is kind of, they're not dismissing you, but they're choosing certain things to reveal or not reveal. And of course, sometimes people can't remember names, but I would probably be able at this point to know when someone should remember a name really, and they're not, because they mightn't want to say something. And it's perfectly understandable, because, you know, in communities, Leslie Pole Hartley used to say this, and it's often quoted again, that the past is a foreign country, we don't live there. But for people living in rural communities or in urban communities, they do live there. And, you know, like, sometimes they just don't want to reveal something that's going to cause hurt or trouble in a local place. You know, I think you can maneuver your way around that, and you can, you know, when you show you're trustworthy and show you're credible in terms of the way you use your material, etc., people will generally reveal most things to you, but there's always going to be some things that people will hold back, and there might be very valid reasons for that, Nell. Nell, isn't it? The last question. Yeah. But I think in some cases, certainly I get her point that some people are saying they can't remember. What?
Mel.
Oh, sorry, Mel. My apologies, Mel. Mel, yeah, some people will hold back. And, you know, that I understand that. I completely understand that. That's part of the culture. That's part of the community dynamic, and you have to respect that.
Brilliant. And I suppose this is Dermot, so I suppose coming in a little bit on that in terms of the silence. So Dermot Brannock, a great presentation, and I personally agree with Tomás's perspective. And in Moore Street, we have collected a lot of stories and memories. Another question for Tomás in reference to silence. Does he think there was a silence about physical and sexual abuse of women by the hands of these British soldiers? And of course, we can't forget it did happen in the Civil War as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was involved in a programme there, Liz, a number of months back called Cogar Mná on TG Cahir, and or I think it was TG Cahir, it was RT or TG Cahir, both, but yeah, and that explored that whole issue, and definitely it did happen. Without a doubt, it did happen. And again, for women during that time, you know, because of the nature of the society, you know, and also because of the fact that particularly during the War of Independence, you know, you can't forget that if the British forces did something like that, and they did often, you know, it was next to impossible to get justice for that. You know, because if you go to the Sinn Féin court, there's very little they can do outside of what they're already doing in terms of confronting British rule. And then if it is the IRA, and you know, we can't be blind to the fact that of course Republicans would have done that. I don't see the evidences to the same scale, partly because of the way in which they're embedded in the community, and in a lot of ways they depend on the community support. That doesn't mean there's going to be people like any organization who are going to, you know, behave in that way. But without a doubt, the society would have dictated, unfortunately, that a lot of women wouldn't have spoken about it if they did suffer sexual violence. With 48,000 raids, I think with 48,000 raids, you know, you can't, you know, discount the fact that there would be tremendous opportunity for sexual violence and physical violence against people within those homes. And I've come across obviously multiple cases of it. You know, so definitely it did happen. Definitely it wasn't spoken about. That was the culture of the community as much as it was the reality of the kind of legislative environment or the judicial environment at the time. Okay.
And now, sorry, I'm just going between the tablet and the phone
go
here.
Ahead. No,
from Geraldine Con Collins, brilliant, Tomás. Put your old friend John Fahey didn't live to see this. Only passed last month. R.I.P. John, my old townie, Killaloe, County Clare.
John Fahey. The last time I gave a talk, Liz, for Trasna Natira, about maybe 6 weeks ago or 2 months ago, with Marcus Howard, John was at it with his daughter Miriam, and he spoke during this part of the episode or the talk. I got to know John about 10 years ago when he contacted me. It was part of my research into the Scariff Martyrs, and he was a Killaloe man, tremendously connected. His mother was a teacher. His mother walked across the bridge the day after the Scariff Martyrs were murdered. You know, so it was part of his cultural background, and he was really connected to it, but unfortunately he wasn't too well. But yeah, he would certainly be sitting there with his daughter Miriam tonight if he was alive. But we'll remember him, and you know, he's mentioned in the book, you know, as his mother has mentioned as well. So we'll remember John.
Brilliant. And just again, so just Patrick Kilfeather again, being charitable, was Charlie Flanagan overly influenced by the spin doctors who have no interest or understanding of the complexities of our history, and for whom short-term perceived political expediency is their master?
Oh, okay, I'll have to take a breath now before I answer that.
We can move forward.
No, I don't. No, we won't move forward. Absolutely not. No, I'm happy to deal with that head on. Charlie wasn't influenced at all, because you follow Charlie's narrative for years. I mean, that's his narrative. You know, that's been his narrative for years. It's his narrative since then. He's been quite bullish since then about it. No, that's Charlie Flanagan's view. That's Charlie Flanagan's outlook. He just forgot or has never realised that that outlook doesn't, find any traction with people on the ground, who understand very deeply what the British forces did, and also understand that, it is no insult to the RIC, even singling them out as the Irish members of the RIC. It's no insult to say that they shouldn't be commemorated as a force. There isn't an insult in that. In my view, it's a recognition of their role as a constituent part of British rule and an active part of trying to maintain British rule when the country had voted for independence. But anyway, in answer to the question, no, it wasn't spin doctors. Of course, they're very important to the government and they influence a lot of things. But no, I don't. I think that's given Charlie Flanagan a get-out clause that I don't think he deserves, to be honest. Or Leo Varadkar, for that matter.
Brilliant, Tomás. And again, just a few comments. Gerard Brown, excellent lecture as always from Tomás. Noel McGlynn, fantastic talk, a very interesting. I think, yes, we did say that one. How communities are traumatised to this day. Jim Ansborough, an absolutely profound presentation. Thank you. Tola, hey Tola, just an excellent presentation. Thank you. We have John, Maria Teresa Linares. Thank you for this excellent lecture. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down, so I don't want to miss any of them. And you sort of did, you did answer the question. There was a question raised earlier, Tomás. You did answer it in the presentation, but just in terms of sort of the general name, the generalisation of the Crown Forces being the Black and Tans, and even the IRA do in the witness statements. But you just want to sort of reiterate what you did say about that?
No, I will, and thanks for bringing it up, actually, because I wanted to reflect on it a little bit, because it is often mentioned, that there's this kind of failure to break apart the forces, or the Black and Tans have been blamed for everything. But without a doubt, I've done hundreds of interviews and I've seen far more evidence of a full understanding of the different elements of the forces, but also, as I said, that they were fully aware as well that the RIC were involved, the Black and Tans were involved, the auxiliaries were involved, all on the same side. And in many cases came together on raids. Not always, but often came together on raids. But certainly, beyond dispute, were on the same side. And multiple people have said that to me, sure, they were all Tans. And that was said very consciously. That the Tan wasn't a reflection of the specific constituent force, but the Tans was the categorization for the broader force that had comprised of the RIC auxiliaries and British Army, in some cases as well, who were in certain parts of the country were very actively involved as well. But it is an important point to make, because again, it is repeated that it's almost an implication that people don't really know the difference between the Black and Tans and the RIC, and that's not the case in my view. Or some people will not maybe recognise the difference, but in my case, most people know fully well. And they also would have known, the stories come through where there might be an RIC sergeant who does step in and stops a burning because he's a decent man or whatever, and he's able in that day to stop a burning taking place, and that's recognised. That's mentioned, that's referred to, that's acknowledged. But don't forget as well, on the flip side, you had this constant reference to Shinners. Even tonight there, when Archie was singing the song, he's talking about the Shinners, even though technically Sinn Féin are a political party and the IRA are a military unit. So there's always a broad categorization in these times. But yeah, sorry, I think I'm repeating myself now.
No. That's fair, because it is just something that always does crop up, Tomás. And as I said, like if you look at the witness statements in military archives, the IRA even referred to them, especially in Dublin, when you have more, it's the auxiliaries that are and the British military rather than the Tans. If you look at Dublin today, rather than the way it was 100 years ago. Again, just more comments. Great press, Joseph Rain. Well done, Tomás. Great press in your voice. That we said that one before, and now there is more. I'm trying not to repeat, but fantastic presentation. Great as always, Tomás. Tomás, and Mel, thanks again for pointing this out. You did this last week. Happy May Day to everyone. So
yes,
significant day, Tomás. I know you were meant to be on last week, but Dan stole that day.
He stole my slot. Yeah, I won't forgive him.
James Connolly is with you tonight.
That's right.
And I am now. I'm just going through. Micheál, do you want to step in? I'm just going to go through again and just see if there's any more comments coming in.
Yeah, no, it's just blown away by what I've been hearing tonight, both in the original presentation and in the replies to the questions, and the reaction obviously to it. But just one thought going through my own mind is I had nobody involved in my family at all in the Easter Rising, War of Independence, thankfully, or the Civil War. But my mother was an orphan in Rathnew in County Wicklow when she was about 6 years of age. And I was asking her for family tree reasons, etc. once. When she was about 2000, she was about 80 at this stage. I was asking her, about her life and what things gone up, and she couldn't remember. She was losing her memory on most things. There was only one memory she had, and that was one day in the orphanage when the nuns came running around and telling everybody to hide, to hide, to hide, hide anywhere. Get out of the way, get out of sight, because the Black and Tans were in town. And that was the one memory that she could remember when everything else was going. It was the one memory that stayed with her virtually to the end of her life. And just shows how terrifying that must have been for everybody at the time as they were just coming through.
I think, Micheál, it's a really good example because, sometimes people would kind of, not that they question me, but they'd kind of question whether, when I talk about a child's memory of that time, let's say if it was Catherine Talty or whoever, that surely they don't remember it. But when something happens with such intensity, and children as well, like what your mother was probably reacting to was the image of the nuns and the fear of the nuns, because they children gain from body language and from the behavior of adults around them. That's what sticks in their mind. And they wouldn't have seen nuns frightened, at all. So to see that and to see the fear and to experience that fear and feel it, like that sticks in your mind. And I've seen that on multiple occasions where, a memory is so intense and a community is the same, like tradition to the community is like memory to the individual. Like, so when a community goes through something like the War of Independence, it remembers because the experience is so intense, it endures. And I think your mother's experience is reflective of large parts of the country in that context.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the other thing of just thinking, it's a more general thing, but Liz, you and I both would have seen this in Cuimhneamh jail, people coming in with memories to remember things that they had, just the tours would bring up for them. They would mention them to us afterwards, quite often, little stories, tiny ones that wouldn't make the books perhaps, but little stories out there which had stuck with them. And often they wouldn't even know what the stories were about. They would be asking us, what was this about?
Yeah, they're there. You see, I mean, there are so many. I mean, I was talking earlier about the broad nature of the experience leaves all of these stories there, and sometimes they're retained in families where they know it exactly. Sometimes the story is just floating around in a community and might be remembered partially, but there's no question. And it just never made sense to me, like for that. I know, let's say when you go back to the Robin Dudley Edwards time or T.W. Moody, like they were controlling the academic history, but even in the last 20-30 years, you've seen like a complete failure in lots of ways to get down to the ground where this history actually happened and to try and figure it out. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I come back in, Micheál?
Yeah,
just
go ahead,
a couple of comments and questions. Dan, he said he was going to do this to you. He was going to ask you questions.
I knew Dan would throw a hand grenade in somewhere.
So hi Tomás, great presentation, and Dan was our speaker last week. So my ears pricked up when you mentioned about directing anger towards the people at the top to deploy the Tans and the Ogsies. It's justifiable anger, most definitely, but is anger a useful prism through which to examine history generally, or specifically in the Irish case, not least as we have reaped the dividends of the peace process and are trying to come to grips with the complex legacy of the Civil War?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, it's actually a very good question. I mean, obviously, when I was talking about anger, I'm talking about the fact that there is often when this period is discussed, there's an almost visceral anger, the way in which people reflect on it, because that anger is inherited. You inherit the feelings, the emotions, and one of those emotions is definitely anger, directed at usually the Black and Tans or the forces responsible during that time. So what I was talking about is that if there's anger there, it should be certainly at least partially directed at those responsible for sending those forces in there. I'm not advocating, for anger for anyone or for anger against anyone. I'm just talking about the nature of the feelings around that and the I suppose the way in which we should consider distilling those feelings. But that's a historic thing. Of course, I don't advocate, and I know Dan wouldn't be implying that, I don't advocate any lingering feelings. Nobody in 2021 is a member of the Black and Tans, or was a member of the Black and Tans. But I think understanding is really critical, and I mentioned that earlier, and I know Dan will agree with this as well in terms of the Civil War, because you could have the same levels of anger towards different sides in the Free State, or the anti-treaty IRA, and I don't think they're particularly useful at this point. I mean, I'm not dismissing them, I'm not ignoring them, because feelings are there and they have to be respected. But I think understanding and trying to figure out what the reality of the environment was like is probably much more instructive or constructive at this point. But I hope that clears that up anyway, and that Dan isn't too, I hope he's not too offended by me challenging Winston Churchill anyway. He loved me saying that.
Okay, and again, just amazing comments coming in, Tomás. Everyone is just raving about your talk. And Bernard Joseph Malloy, the fantastic, from Donna and Bernie Joe in Southampton. Yeah, Dan, cheers, Tomás. Yeah, good. So he's that's great. And I suppose, Tomás, because we actually tried to get you last year to do a talk when we were planning the annual conference, but because of the pandemic, and we were determined, you had a year and a half's notice pretty much that you were going to do a talk this year for us, and it's been an amazing. I knew you wouldn't disappoint, but you made that connection at the start of your presentation because there is a direct link to the Custom House, and absolutely. It is through Jimmy Slattery.
Absolutely. And it's really important because again, it's one of those things where I wanted to draw the connection between the Fenian, Michael Slattery, his uncle, and all of that, because that's really important. But then it shows, I'm from East Clare, where Jimmy was from. He was actually between Bodyke and Feakle, and Bodyke would be my hurling club, I'd say. And he would have been known for sure, he would have been definitely known. His brother was involved in the Feakle area, his two brothers, in fact. So there's a reality that there nothing overcome the importance of the local experience in the War of Independence to local people, right? So when people talk about, you ask someone about, let's say, May 1921 or 1921, the War of Independence, they'll gravitate to their local incident first, right? That doesn't mean the Custom House event isn't massively significant, or people don't realise it's massively significant. But because of the nature of place, because of the nature of geography and identity, people would probably in Feakle or Bodyke talk more about what happened in that place than what Jimmy Slattery did in Dublin, if that makes sense. It's not downplaying at all what Jimmy did. He was definitely recognised, obviously, as one of the squad, recognised as taking the Free State side, obviously, in the Civil War as well. He also lived the rest of his life in Kildare, so he wasn't living in the community, which obviously has a role as well. So it's a really important direct connection to the Custom House, and Jimmy Slattery obviously was a remarkable man in terms of his involvement, and at the highest level of the IRA in Dublin for a long period during that time.
And just on that, Tomás, because I know, like, and Micheál and myself, just through doing our own research, and the example I give would be the Haleses in West Cork, and the fact that their father, like in West Cork, the famine was a child at the time, and West Cork being devastated by the famine, especially Skibbereen. And when you read their testimonies or talk to Tom's son, you get how important the stories that they heard from their parents influenced them. And what I came to the conclusion was the Haleses were going to do something. Whether it was a revolution or it was Labour or something, but there was something instilled in them from those stories. So the impact of memory and how it can influence the next generation, traumatize the next generation, because that's also the intergenerational trauma is another aspect of it, Tomás, isn't it?
It is. I mean, and there's a thing in kind of memory studies called post-memory, and it's used to kind of explain, you know, when you have somebody in front of you that's talking about, for example, the Black and Tans, and they're talking in such a way that you would almost be led to believe they were there, you know, such is the nature of their recollection or their tradition. But you realize they were born in 1925 or 1926. And that's because the way in which they inherit the stories has such power and emotion that they become part of that story and they become part of that tradition. And then for people like the Haleses or whoever it might be in those contexts, like there's also a responsibility, I think, that comes, or a sense of responsibility, a sense of duty that I think a lot of the 1916 men felt, you know, and there's a feeling of responsibility maybe that they need to do something in their time. We see that manifest in, for example, like the Haleses is quite kind of, you know, not the Haleses, but you see it manifest in broader Cork with McSweeney's, for example, McCorton, you know, who are, they're troubled, they're deeply troubled. When Terence McSweeney writes 40 days into his hunger strike that the pain of Easter week is gone, he writes to Cathal Brugha to say that because he has felt such trauma that he wasn't able to participate in this seminal moment that he'd been maybe waiting for since he was hearing the stories as a child, like the Haleses did. So that plays out in the way in which people, I suppose, exercise that sense of responsibility sometimes. But I wanted to make the point that that's a real direct example, you know, with a direct family who suffered trauma, but the community at large will inherit a feeling. Now, it mightn't be as strong or as visceral, but it might like, how did the IRA manage to get such broad support in terms of safe houses, in terms of the kind of passive support we'd describe it as, you know, that was definitely there in broad numbers. And I think they got that because there would have been a feeling within the community, you know, that here's one side, the Republican movement, fighting against the British side. And they realize where their tradition sits in that narrative. And their tradition sits with a people who were evicted, or within a community where people were evicted, even if their family weren't evicted. And that's the side they sit on. And that manifests in sometimes passive support, sometimes active support. It could be turning the head the other way. It could be refusing to identify somebody. You know, these are the ways in which those feelings manifest themselves during times of, you know, revolution.
Okay. And Tomás, again, comments and questions. So Tola, sort of just going back to the RIC, they were established to impose the active union of British rule. The Tansnoggs were this is going to the sort of the generalisation of the names. The Tansnoggs were integral to the RIC as an organisation, but in contemporary experience and later in public memory, they became perhaps the distilled essence of the brutality and terror of British rule, even though it was the regular RIC who often proved more cruel and vindictive to their fellow countrywomen and men. And that's certainly the case with a lot of the reprisals, Tomás, especially around the West, like Reneen and so on. Milton Malbay, am I correct?
Yeah, Milton Malbay, Lahinch, and in Steinman. But there's an interesting one last week where Dan, if Dan is still listening, I was ready to tell a story because it was 100 years from last Saturday where an event took place. And it's a useful example because 100 years last Saturday in Kilrush town, there was an ambush, and Kilrush is in West Clare, deep into West Clare for people who don't know it. But there were more East Clare IRA fighters in the town that night than there were West Clare IRA fighters, ironically. And that's because between 30 and 40 East Clare IRA men had travelled 45 miles from East Clare to support the West Clare IRA in an ambush on British forces. There were about 200 British forces with Marines, soldiers, and Black and Tans RIC. One man was killed, and his name was Sergeant John McFadden from Derry. Now, what's ironic and interesting, and speaks to the point that the previous contributor said, is that 6 months before that, McFadden was in Fecal in East Clare, when after an ambush on 2 RIC men, where there were 2 men killed, William Stanley and Francis Doherty, 2 RIC men, he was in the next line of RIC men, but he escaped. But that night, he led the Black and Tans around Fecal to burn houses and to execute reprisals. But it was ironic, he was moved out of Fecal because he was in danger after that. But 6 months later, he was the one that was shot 45 miles away by the same men who were in Fecal during the ambush that night. So definitely the RIC men who acted in that way were remembered, you know, and you know, we see a lot of action or of actions against RIC men around the time of the truce. And it's tough. You have to say it's tough, like, because, you know, some of them were very, very vicious, and it was usually fairly accurate in the sense that the ones who were committing themselves during the War of Independence were the ones targeted. But what you did see, of course, is then families being, you know, thrown out of, RIC families being thrown out of villages, having to immigrate, etc. And you have to recognise at a human level, you know, that's very, very difficult for lots of families, and especially if their husband are killed or their father's killed. So it was remembered, but I think there's an intimate nature to the War of Independence, you know, which is borne out by the evidence that in most cases, the people who were targeted were people who had committed themselves in some way during that War of Independence, and had been sometimes, as that man suggested, were worse than the Black and Tans and worse than the British forces themselves.
And again, just Mel McGann and totally Mel, Terry Fagan is just, he's amazing. But Terry Fagan in Dublin's North Inner City is a great testament to the local experience and stories of this time, with his interviews of the older people in the community. Like yourself, Tomás, like Martin Bob O'Dwyer down in Cashel, Lord of Mercy on him. And thanks to people like yourself, Terry and Martin, that at least are now on record. They are recorded for future generations. Again, just Liam Shortall had a question. What was the context of Fielding's comments? Were they unguarded? Did he get into trouble for these insubordinate comments?
No, he didn't get into trouble. I mean, he was a retired senior British figure at the time, so I suppose he couldn't really get in too much trouble. He had written a letter to a British newspaper, and he was just making the point about British policy, because you see, at that point, you know, there had been a big kickback in Britain about the reprisals and the behaviour of British forces. And you had this internationalisation of the story, which was deliberate, and De Valera's in America at the time, and there's more and more attention on particularly the reprisals, be it in North Clare or be it in Balbriggan. And there's definitely a kickback in Britain against the behaviour of their forces in Ireland. And I suppose he's speaking to that when he wrote that letter. So it wasn't out of tune with what other officials were saying outside of the government. So no, he didn't get in trouble for that. He was married, actually, funnily, as a pure coincidence, he was married to Robert Emmet's great-grand niece.
There you go, Michal.
Yes,
yeah.
And sorry, just again, Tomás, Patrick again, Tomás, Liz and Michal, I know he's online from around 7. We were indeed trying to make sure we didn't mess up this time. Yeah. Maybe we got there.
Nearly got it
right. Thank you all so much. And this is so true, Tomás. When I read The Time of the Tans, I shed a tear, and I've read a lot. Tomás really expressed the humanity of it all, the fears of the people, the horrors they endured at the hands of the Crown forces, and how those memories are still so real. A very moving presentation again tonight. So there you have, and every word of that is true, Tomás. And I cannot say it enough again. Everyone, if you have not read Time of the Tans, please get it. The libraries will be back open, so get onto your local library, click and collect, and Mercier Press should have it back in stock. It is a must read to understand this period and how it impacted not just on those who took part, but those who were actually in the community. And Tomás isn't paying me to say that. It's genuine. It really is genuine.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Now, and coming from you especially, thanks a lot, Liz. I really appreciate that.
Oh no, Michal, is there any other points? Because Tomás, I know
just one thing that occurs to me, and it's a point you actually raised before, Liz. Coming back to the Custom House, I mean, as we know, in the aftermath of it, the IRA thought it was great, thought it was a great success, and they commemorated it. But then, over time, that changed, and I'm just wondering about the distortion or the abuse of memory, where, you know, was it the Civil War that changed it? Was it the Dev Collins divide or whatever that changed people's view of the Custom House?
Yeah.
Or what? You know, and I'm not asking for an answer to that question, but just what do you think about the distortion or abuse of memory over time?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like, memory operates on different levels, and I think, you know, for me, there's three main areas. There's national memory, there's community memory, and then there's, let's say, we'll call it family or private memory. And I think the most sort of abused area, if you wanted to put it that way, would be national memory, or state memory, we call it. Because again, while it like in 2016, I mean, there's like the military archives were involved, etc. There was a lot of great work done in 2016. But in previous, or actually not just in previous, but the state remembers according to what's happening at the time the state is remembering, right? And so whatever narrative in 1966 was put out about what was happening in 1966. And that's the same in 1941, it's the same in 1970. It's about the state or the government in power at that particular time. So I think when we look at the state remembering any time after the Civil War, Michal, we're looking at a state that is remembering the fight for independence at a time when there is an active, in different levels, IRA movement that is continuing to pursue a 32-county republic. So there's always a contingency on the way the state remembers. So say, for example, the example I made of 1941, when they're remembering the fight for independence as a state, when they have 1,000 people interned. Now, people can validate that in different ways. I'm not making that point, but I'm making the point that that influences the way in which the state recalls all things, the way in which it discusses all things, and the way in which something like the Custom House or the consequence of it, and you know, the archival thing is always brought up, obviously. So that could be celebrated early on. Then over time, the state, when it's involved in that, can put a different narrative on that. Does that make sense? Because the state is invested in protecting the state, and the last thing it wants to do is to put too much light on an action that could be deemed as irresponsible at that time. So if 1941 or 1971, they're saying, wasn't it fantastic that an IRA unit went into the Custom House and burnt it down? Wasn't that brilliant? You know, if they're saying that, then their sense would be that would be to encourage someone in 1971 to potentially do the same thing, you know?
Right.
So, so that, I'm not saying the state shouldn't remember, but there is an absolute, and this is an international phenomenon in memory, like that whatever it is in Spain or Argentina or wherever, the state will remember for the benefit of the state at that time. It's very rarely as pure as it would be on the ground. It's not that the community level isn't influenced, of course it is, but I have found that the community memory is much more interested in what it is actually commemorating, as opposed to the time it's doing the commemoration. I probably just rambled there now. And
no. Excellent.
No, you hit the nail on the head there, Tomás, because thankfully the government messed up in 2016. Because we would have had a very different 2016, because the people just the way people remembered, and the people copped before the government that we have a complicated history and there's ways we can all discuss it and be mature about it. And the government was the one that messed up. Thankfully, they had the funding there that the communities could go and do all these amazing projects. And the people weren't afraid to tackle the sort of you know, not the nicer parts of
no, absolutely.
that. So,
and can I say, Liz, as well, I mean, I don't know if this came out across the lecture, but like in terms of the War of Independence as well, you know, I mentioned the films that were produced, like, you know, Irish Destiny, etc. And there's often this criticism, and even with the Dorothy McArdle or Conbarry or all this, there's this presentation of this kind of the heroic, noble IRA and the sadistic Black and Tans, right? And that's often, again, implied like that's the way people remember on the ground, and it's wrong, right? But again, when I go back down to the ground, same thing as the women, people on the ground know full well the brutality that was at the heart of it, the fact that the IRA in lots had to be ruthless, but also that there were people in the IRA that were being, you know, were behaving, you know, very wrongly, you know, and that they were capable of that, you know, that comes right through to me in the interviews I've done, you know, but they recognize that at the heart of their struggle was something legitimate, and they recognize at the heart of what the British forces were trying to do was illegitimate in the context of their views. So, yeah, so there's a subtlety of understanding, right, you know, in most cases anyway, in communities across the country, I think.
And Tomás, on that, because the work again we'd be doing, and it'd be work that you would do with community groups as well, and that they are really telling the national story. You actually cannot tell the national story without the local story, because those events happen as a result of these ordinary men and women who were put in these extraordinary situations, who lived in an extraordinary time, and who didn't know what they were getting themselves into, as in the impact it would have on them later on. And I think that's what has been so fantastic about the decade of centenaries, is that the communities have taken ownership of it again, and they're not going to be written out.
Yeah, no, 100%. And look, I know it's something you felt for a long time as well, is like that they have to be part of that telling, you know, because as I've mentioned already, they understand it a lot better sometimes than a lot of the people who have been telling the story for years. But also because of the nature of history, if we're going to tell history, you know, it has to be about the simple experiences in different parts of the country, you know, and it's not enough to say there were 48,000 raids, and we mightn't be able to find the memory of all those raids, but we should certainly try and include as many of them as we can, if we can find them, if we can access those stories, the impact of those stories. And it's like, I often think of like an ambush, the analogy of an ambush, where like is a historian's job to identify the personnel involved, you know, the weaponry involved, the number of people killed, maybe the military strategy used in it, and then to depart the ambush scene. In my view, the historian metaphorically must wait and follow the bodies home, you know, and almost wait with those families for 20, 30, 40 years to see the impact. Like I talked about Francie Murphy's death in 1919, like his sister lived with that memory for 46 years and literally on her deathbed revealed the hurt of it, you know, and that's part of the history, that's part of the experience, part of the impact. And I think we have to include that if we're trying to figure out what it was like, you know, because we can't just leave it as a statistical account of what took place. You know, you have to include the broader echoes of all that story.
And again, just it's fantastic comments coming in, Tomás, but we will let you go soon.
No, you're fine, I'm okay, I'm all right. No worry, I'm enjoying this.
Tomás has young kids as well. But I suppose Frank McGuigan just asked, and I suppose maybe is embarrassed the right word to use, and I suppose we're generalising if we just use the state, because there are politicians that are interested in the history and are actually very supportive of the work that is being done. But why is the state so embarrassed with our wonderful history? Can you answer that, Tomás, or what would you think?
Well, I mean, what I would say is kind of almost to repeat what I said earlier, but I think the state is always, and I say the state here, I could be talking about, you know, America, or I could be talking about Britain, or, well, there are probably two bad examples, but let's say Argentina, Spain. You know, the state is interested in the state. And, you know, when you have people, of course, in any government, you'll have people, you know, who are interested in history or supportive of or different views on things, but the state is interested in the state. And, you know, the state is always conscious of the way in which it will reflect on its own revolutionary past, because what was happening in 1920 was a group confronting the state, right? They weren't happy with the state, and they were confronting it, and they were breaking down that state, and they were looking to replace it, right? So any state in a contemporary context would be very cautious about encouraging that capacity. So do you want as a state to encourage the people, and again, whatever part of the world you're in, do you want to remind them of their ability to mobilize, their ability to break down a state, or do you want them to encourage loyalty to the state? So there's a balance there sometimes when the state is looking at an insurrectional past, what it might consider encouraging. Now, I'm trying to explain the state. I'm not saying that's right, but I think that certainly would play a part. Because, for example, in most states don't encourage protests, right? So, or certainly when we see a protest that goes beyond the point of being kind of irrelevant to actually something that could change something, then you see the state reacting very aggressively sometimes. So at the same time, does that state want to be, glorifying past examples when the people rose up against the state and actually took it down? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, I think, I suppose it's you don't have to answer this question, Tomás, or maybe sort of a nicer way of a less sort of a loaded way of putting it. Can you see United Ireland in the near future with sort of recent with Brexit and stuff like and events that have happened recently?
I certainly have thought about it. I think about it a lot. It's important to me. I believe in a United Ireland, and believe we should have a United Ireland. The steps to get from here to there are many, and the border poll is a question that has been discussed in recent times. I would have massive concerns about the discourse around a border poll, and again, it probably plays into the point I just made about the state, because in the Irish state, controlling a discussion around the fundamental changing of that state, I would have questions. And I think, to be fair, I don't think it's out of line to say that the press in this state has not been very positive towards the idea of United Ireland over the last 30 or 40 years. So how is that going to affect the narrative or the discussion around the possibility of a United Ireland? Because then often when we hear a discussion about it or read about it, it's put in fundamentally negative terms. That the problems we're going to take in. Are we happy to take this in? Are we happy to lose that? When in fact that could be turned in another way. So to more directly answer the question, will there be a United Ireland? I think there will be a United Ireland. I think it'll be a bit longer than maybe people have been predicting of recent times. I do think we're foolish to think there's stability in international affairs when we look at history. We hope we don't go back to world wars, none of that. But I mean, we've in history we've hoped that before. But one of for me, and this is getting into kind of geopolitics, but I think the underestimation of the nation state for me is a flaw in political analysis internationally, because states are still states. Okay, there's a growing international community and we have the European Union, but still it comes back down to it. And the pandemic is an interesting example. While the European Union stayed together, you still had Germany going off securing its own PPE, you still had our vaccines, you still had France looking after France. So I think, the international sort of changes can happen and they can turn the world upside down, and Brexit's an example of that. And it's entirely likely or possible that we'll have Scottish independence before too long. And if we have Scottish independence, I think that shifts the entire discussion around the United Ireland in one particular direction. But my big concern really in that context would be how the discussion, how the narrative, how the understanding of it is framed between a proposition of United Ireland and actually getting to the point of achieving it.
Brilliant. And Tomás, just one more, well, a couple more things. Michael O'Connell again, thanks. Cuimhneamh Mogiv Tomás, and he also said that the government did mess up in 2016. I've seen communities down here in West Clare. This is Michael O'Connell. I'm not sure if you know him, Tomás.
I know him very well. Yeah, great man.
Communities down here in West Clare do great ceremonies in remembrance of 1916. I've seen primary school kids wanting to be Countess Markievicz fighting over the role, and it was great. And it's amazing the amount of kids, the response from school children to this history is amazing. And the work you're doing, Tomás, because you're telling it from the ordinary person's perspective, it is their community. I think that's the hook to make that connection with the school kids.
It sure is, and I think the history, the treatment of history in the school has to be looked at again, and it has to be pulled back, and it has to be returned, and it has to be altered into a local focused exploration. And you can go from the local to the international, once you have people bought into the notion of the importance of history, but you need to do it by relating it to their local landscape and connecting them to why your past is important to you, and then you move it outwards. Whereas what we had was something that was moving to like the French Revolution or the American Revolution or whatever, and then children not showing an interest, and then suddenly they drop it. So yeah, it's obviously critical. Yeah.
Okay, Tomás, just before we let you go, we just have to do a promo for next week's talk. And I'm just going to share screen now and get it up. So everyone, so we're continuing on next Saturday, the 8th of May. And the talk next week is going to be done by DCC historian in residence Cathy Scuffle. I'm sure many of you know Cathy. She's the historian in residence now for the whole of the south side of Dublin, and we've lost her out. Or the work she's been doing is amazing. But Cathy is looking at the Ballyfermot train ambush, and as you can see from the title, continuing the fight unhindered, because a big myth connected with the story of the Custom House was the Dublin Brigade of the IRA were wiped out, that they weren't a force to be reckoned with, and through our research, myself, Cathy and others, we've sort of discovered the opposite. So this talk is about the last major engagement undertaken by the Dublin Brigade of the IRA on the 8th of July 1921, 3 days before the truce came into effect. But also, a bit like what Tomás sort of touched on tonight, there was a direct link to the Custom House, because members of the 4th Battalion Active Service Unit who were on Buck Bridge on the 25th of May, given that protective cover, were the men that were involved in this ambush. So you can see there's a thread always running. We can always bring it back to the Custom House in some shape or form. But the usual 8 o'clock next Saturday, please tune in, and we will put up the event page early on in the week. And I'm just going to stop sharing that and go back to Tomás and Micheál. Micheál, is there anything that you'd like to say before I then say thank you to Tomás?
Well, I think a huge thanks to everybody who contributed questions tonight.
Yes.
Which obviously, which enhanced so much. A wonderful, wonderful presentation by Tomás. I don't think, I think most of us expected it, but absolutely fantastic. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Just all I can do is say quick ordigas last.
And Tomás, again, look, the comments are still coming in. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you tonight for an excellent talk. Thank you again for an excellent lecture. Go to bed, will you? We're trying, Joseph. We're trying.
The battle of powers now is where I'm going.
Tomás, seriously, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much. Because I think you've really opened up a lot of questions. There's a lot we don't yet fully know about the War of Independence, and we need to start bringing it back to the local level. I would just like to say an absolutely massive thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight for your questions. I'm sure Tomás is delighted with all of the engagement with you. You have always been there, either in person and now online, over the last 12 years with us in some shape or form. So we really do appreciate the support. Thanks also to the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage for supporting this series of online talks. And Tomás, just, oh God, the most important thing. Thank you. Thank you, Mark O'Brien, for reminding me. So Tomás's next book, The Scariff Martyrs. And I've had a preview. Tomás, when is the book out?
The book will be out on the 10th of September, Liz, all going well, from Mercier Press. And obviously whether I'll be able to have a launch or not is all dependent on the pandemic. But certainly, yeah, September the 10th is the release date, all going well, but certainly it'll be out in September.
Okay, so we'll all be tweeting and sharing that on Facebook when we know that's coming out. Thanks, and everyone, if you thought Time of the Tans was good, if you've read it, Scariff Martyrs is fantastic. So
Thank you very much, Liz.
Come here, Tomás, you must be exhausted. And
no, I'm not. I have more energy after it. I'm delighted. And can I just say, like, I really appreciate your kind words for both yourself and Micheál. And like, I've great friends with you, Liz, and I'm glad to count you as a friend. But I've admired you for a long time before you were my friend. And Micheál, I've fantastic admiration for the work you've done for a long number of years as well. So it's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm really honoured that you asked me to do it.
Tomás, thank you so much. Everyone, Tomás, we've kept you for nearly 2 hours, 40 minutes. This is a record.
Is it?
God love Kathy next week. But everyone, look, we'll say good night to everyone. Thank you so much. Hopefully we'll see you next week. And Tomás, once again, thank you so much.
You're very welcome, lads. Okay.
Thank you.
Slán.